across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good afternoon, welcome to Talk Drive. I'm Peter Cardwell. There's an awful lot to discuss today. We're going to be talking to the former Justice Secretary David Gauke a bit later on in the programme about this huge review into sentencing about sex offenders possibly facing mandatory chemical castration, and at the same time prisoners possibly eligible for release after serving a third of their sentence behind bars. So 1/3 behind bars, 2/3 in community. Is that fair? Also short sentences as well. Decriminalising what Robert Jenrick says. He says they're actually decriminalising things such as burglary, theft and assault, things that people will be sent to prison for a short period of time for. We're also reflecting on those dreadful murders in Washington, D.C. 2 Israeli embassy officials killed because they work for Israel, because they are Jewish. Absolutely horrendous. And reflecting on the wider situation in the Middle East, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Lots to talk about in terms of all of that. Also, Keir Starmer blamed for emboldening anti-Semitic attackers. Is that what has happened? The problem is when you say things like globalise the Intifada, well, that's what happened. Not that Keir Starmer, of course, has said that. Big public sector pay rises are looming. Could they make strikes more likely? How much money should we be paying our public services? We'll get, of course, an update on the sport as well before the end of the programme. And as well, yesterday, if you were watching or listening to Drive, you'll know that in the Oval Office, Donald Trump was talking to the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa and talked to him about white persecution. Well, how much of that is actually going on? There is some, definitely, no doubt about that, to some of the farmers that are in South Africa. We'll talk to a professor at Cambridge about that who is South African, getting the latest on that and actually an idea of how widespread the problem is, because sometimes these things get lost in the drama of what happened in the Oval Office. The substantive aspect of what is happening, that's what we are going to discuss. Lots to discuss, as I say. This is my show, but it's your show too. I want to make sure that as many people as possible get their point across. Calls are the number one thing that I like. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text to make sure it comes up on the screen in front of me. You can tweet me at talkTV, follow me at Peter Cardwell. Remember, the main number does 3 things. You can send me a voice note, less than a minute please, and then Sam will play them out. You can also send me a WhatsApp text message or give me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Loads to discuss between now and 7 o'clock. Stay with us here on Talk Drive. Well, earlier, the Justice Secretary, Shabnam Mahmood, set out the plans for chemical castration for serious sex offenders. This is what she said.
I also asked the review to consider how we manage sex offenders. The review has recommended we continue a pilot of so-called medication to manage problematic sexual arousal. I will go further, with a national rollout beginning in 2 regions covering 20 prisons, and I am exploring whether mandating the approach is possible. Of course, it is vital that this approach is taken alongside psychological interventions that target other causes of offending, like asserting power and control.
So what do you think? Do you think sex offenders should be castrated? Is that a way forward? Also, can you extend that? What about rapists, for example? Someone who has raped someone is far more likely to do it when they get out of prison again. Can they be rehabilitated? Should they be chemically castrated? What do you think? 0344 499 1000. Shabnam Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, reflecting on this review by one of her predecessors, a Conservative predecessor, David Gauke, who we're going to talk to a little bit later on in the programme. Well, Shabnam Mahmood also set out plans for the updated early release scheme.
Under this model, an offender will not necessarily leave prison at an automatic point. Instead, their release date will be determined by their behaviour. If they follow prison rules, they will earn earlier release. If they do not, they will be locked up for longer. This echoes the model I witnessed in Texas earlier this year, which cut crime and brought their prison population under control.
Shabnam Mahmood there, the Justice Secretary. What do you think of what she's saying there? Because there are a lot of people who are victims of crime who, of course, want people to be behind bars, to serve their sentence, to pay their debt to society. if they behave themselves, as Shabnam Mahmood is saying there, well, then perhaps they can get out a little bit sooner, should that be the case. And the problem is, time and time again, we report these stories and say this person's got a sentence of 10 years, but we know that they'll be out in 5. Well, actually, it could be 3 1/3 now, given some of this suggestion, some of this review ideas, certainly by David Gauke. We'll talk to him a little bit later on in the programme, but for the meantime I want to speak to David Spencer, who's Head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange. David, I can see the logic of a lot of this in regard to overcrowded prisons, a criminal justice system that's not working, but is it fair?
Good afternoon, Peter. Good to speak to you. I think we can all see some of the reasons behind this. In complete fairness, the government 10 months ago took over a criminal justice system, and particularly a prison system, which is undoubtedly still in complete crisis. So I don't think anyone doubts the need for something to be done. I think the real challenge here is whether the steps that are being proposed are the right ones. And I think if we start from the perspective of what do the public expect from a criminal justice system, certainly when we at Policy Exchange have polled this, as we published on just a couple of months ago, there is a real expectation that what the public want is for the system to be tougher on crime. And I'm really doubtful whether much of what's in this review is going to answer what the public is really looking for.
It could actually be the opposite of that, couldn't it? There could be a lot of people who look at this and say, well, actually, you're rewarding prisoners for following the rules, which of course we want them to do, and perhaps they should have some incentive. But actually, if you say, a judge says you're sentenced to 10 years, and actually the time you spend behind bars is 3 years and 4 months if you do what you're saying. There's a big difference between that, and of course getting out into the community and being under supervisory orders and having to sign in and go and see probation officers and so on, that is a restriction on your liberty, but you're still free. And there'll be lots of victims of crime who say, hold on a second here, you go through the whole process of finally getting a court date, going through, getting all that done, and people actually not spending that long behind bars. It doesn't seem fair, I would imagine, to a number of people. I'm
quite sure that's true, and we recommended fairly recently that what the government is calling the earned early release model is a good model. I think it's probably the right one to be taking rather than automatic release, so that prisoners have to earn the opportunity to leave prison early. And that means that they have to comply with rehabilitation, they have to comply with rehab, they have to comply with training so they can then go out and get a job when they're done. But for that to be something they qualify for after only a third of their sentence seems to me very, very early indeed. And I think most victims of crime would feel that doesn't reflect the way they think the justice system should be operating. Now, the government have done some good things in this, or the independent review have suggested some good things here. They've suggested more open prisons. They've suggested or put a focus on more foreign national offenders being deported. And of course, the government has announced a further 14,000 prison places over the coming years. But the reality is that when you look at this review and the government's decisions so far in the round, they're just not going far enough to be tough on crime in the way the public expect.
What do they need to do, in your opinion, David?
Well, the first thing is that they've committed to 14,000 prison places. The reality is over the next decade, that isn't going to be enough, and we've modelled that. I think we also need to look at the entire early release model as well. But the most important thing they could do, above and beyond everything else, is have a look at how we're dealing with the most prolific offenders. So when we looked at this at Policy Exchange, what we found was that the most prolific offenders, those with 45 convictions already to their name, 45 convictions or more, when they were convicted again of a crime, they were only being sent to prison on half of occasions. And it cannot possibly be right that these, as we call them, hyper-prolific offenders are getting away with committing crimes and not being sent to prison. And what's really disappointing about this review is that essentially these most prolific offenders aren't really dealt with by this review. And it certainly doesn't say that they should be sent to prison every time, which is what we think should happen. And I think the public would say should happen. I'm kind of all over the place, to be honest, on short sentences, because I used to be a special advisor in the Ministry of Justice. I dealt with sentencing. We increased sentences under Robert Buckland, who was then the Lord Chancellor, for the most serious offenders. I'm not sure actually if that was the right thing to do, to be brutally honest, but at the time it felt like the right thing. It's interesting with short sentences because
people get really annoyed that loads of people, prolific offenders, often doing things like shoplifting, 150 convictions for shoplifting, and then eventually, right, you get a 3-month sentence. You might spend 2 months or maybe even those 3 months behind bars. Those sentences aren't a deterrent. They may even harden someone to a life of crime. They're not necessarily effective in any way. But to remove them, well, there's so many people who say, I'm a victim of crime, I'm a victim of theft, burglary, or a shop that's had a shoplifter many, many times. Where is the deterrent there? I'm going to ask David Gawk about that a little bit later on, but I just wonder what your position is on short sentences, because this review essentially says if you're going to be sentenced to anything of less than 3 years, don't really bother. Yeah, well, I think what they've recommended is there is a presumption against, and it still means the magistrate or the judge can sentence someone to prison in exceptional circumstances. The problem with that, and you've touched on it yourself, is when we look at other examples of legislation where these exceptional circumstances can apply. Repeat knife carriers, for example, there's a provision within legislation which says if you're caught carrying a knife for a second time, if you're an adult, then you should be sent to 6 months in prison. What we know is in a third of those cases, judges and magistrates don't send people to prison. So although the review says there's a presumption against short prison sentences unless exceptions apply, it seems to us, looking at the previous cases where this has been put in, that it's very unlikely that judges will end up sentencing. And as you rightly say, when you're dealing with people who have 100, 150 previous convictions, it cannot possibly be right that they get churned through the community punishment, the suspended sentence route yet again, which is why we at Policy Exchange have said those people should be getting a minimum of a 2-year sentence every single time they're convicted of yet another crime. Interesting point from Leslie, who's texted me to say, hi Peter, do you think our human rights Supremo Prime Minister would allow this castration idea to go ahead? Is this retrospective for grooming gangs or Hugh Edwards, says Leslie. Well, the idea, Leslie, certainly is paedophiles, but she makes a very good point. What about rapists, for example? What about people convicted of rape who are very likely to do it again in many cases? I wonder what you think of that and how likely you think that is to actually go ahead, even in the case of paedophiles, David. Yeah, the numbers of prisons where this programme is currently being used is very, very small. And in fact, the number of prisons which the Justice Secretary said she was going to extend it to was actually a small minority of the prisons in the country. My suspicion is, and I don't know for sure because I've not spoken today to special advisors, but based on my recent conversations, I suspect this is an effort by the government to demonstrate just how tough on crime they are. And I suspect they'll be very happy in number 10 with some of the headlines. The Sun headline today saying pedos will be castrated. I suspect number 10 are not displeased with that sort of headline. My suspicion is that if we fast forward in a couple of years, that it's probably a bit of a mirage. And I think it's very unlikely we're going to see compulsory chemical castration of prisoners. But I could be proven wrong, but I'd be surprised to see that. David, thank you very much indeed. Appreciate your thoughts. David Spencer, Head of Crime and Justice at Policy Exchange. Do you think Keir Starmer has the balls to castrate prisoners? Let me know what you think. 0344 499 1000. Alan in Newcastle says, while I 100% agree with chemical and physical castration, we know this will be blocked because it will be infringing on their rights to a family, not to mention how they plan to monitor these offenders. Brad in Cambridge says, this is a nonsense, Peter. They should be punishing prisoners for misbehaving and not following the rules in prison. Good behaviour should be a given, not something to reward them for. That's a really good point, Brad. Ian says, why should prisoners be rewarded for complying with their punishment? They should be rewarded with shorter sentences for successful rehabilitation, not for actually just doing their punishment. And Nick has a more general point. He says, I'm stupid, so I don't understand why, if Britain is 6th or 7th richest country in the world, why is it in such a mess? Everything is falling apart. Why? Where is the money going? Nick, you're absolutely not stupid. It is a perfectly legitimate question. We continue to ask it. There is no real answer on it, actually, apart from the fact that there are many, many things that the government and successive governments, not just Labour, have spent on all sorts of pretty stupid things, to be honest. The migration problem, clearly out of control. We're going to talk about that later, and that takes up an awful lot of money. It's a very good point, Nick. It's a very intelligent point, quite the opposite to the stupidity that you think that you have. You absolutely don't. It's a very legitimate question. We should continue to ask it every single day. Our taxation is the highest taxation as a country, as a proportion of what the country makes since the war. 80 years. What value are we getting for that? Where is the value for money for our taxation? We need to keep asking that question time and time and time again, and we will continue to do so on the show. Thanks in no small measure to Nick, who has asked a very intelligent question. So Nick, please don't do yourself down, and please send me a message anytime, or better still, give me a ring, 0344 499 1000. We're going to talk about UK net migration almost halving in 2024, falling to 431,000. And Angela Rayner, interestingly, not something I had on my bingo card, calling behind the scenes for a curb on migrant benefits. Yes, really. We'll talk to Robert Bates, Research Director at the Centre for Migration Control, about this in just a second, here on Talk.
It only requires one word, yes or no. Is he planning to U-turn on winter fuel cuts?
Yeah. Yes. Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I made clear in my earlier answer that as the economy improves, we want to take measures that will impact on people's lives, and therefore we will look at the threshold, but that will have to be part of a fiscal event.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, hello there. I was just talking to Robert Bates there. He's Research Director of the Centre for Migration Control and joins me live in the studio now. Robert, UK net migration halving to 431,000. Problem solved. Everything's fine, isn't it?
Far from it, unfortunately, Peter. Of course, these levels that we're now seeing at the moment, and it looks like the figure that we'll see in the foreseeable future will settle at around 300, 400,000. Still far beyond what we were actually seeing before the Brexit referendum, that point when obviously people voted emphatically to take back control, a large part of that being about controlling our borders. Unfortunately, what the Conservative government, the last Conservative government did was really put our kind of mass migration experiment on warp speed and escalate it to such an extent that it was almost inevitable that the numbers would start to fall to some extent, and of course the measures that were introduced.
So why have they fallen? Just talk us through that as to why they have fallen.
So the main reason they have fallen is because the Conservatives at the end of their administration, under James Cleverly as well, his stewardship.
He's sort of saying that it's all down to him.
Well, I think he thinks his job's solved.
Marvellous Home Secretary.
I think he thinks it's job solved. Unfortunately, it's not. What they did is they clamped down on a ridiculous fact that people that were coming into low-skilled, low-wage jobs in the care sector were able to bring with them dependents, and you would see instances where people from certain nationalities, for instance Zimbabwe, would bring with them kind of 5-6 dependents at a time, and this was really what caused that explosion. It was the dependent route, and it was really a kind of a low-hanging piece of fruit, this shutting this route down. But unfortunately now, if politicians actually want to get this number down further, they need to start having a frank conversation about the immigration system and how it works with the skills and where we need our kind of, where there are vacancies in the job market. And that's unfortunately, the Labour government didn't seem to address that emphatically in their white paper, and they kicked the can down the road, and we're not going to actually see any measures that will really get to the nooks and crannies of, for instance, why are we allowing sweet shops, why are we allowing Turkish barbers to sponsor workers to come in to the UK? These are the kind of questions that need to start being asked, but they're way off the agenda at the moment.
Just on that figure, 431,000, I mean, that is similar to a city the size of Bristol in a year, people coming to this country, and this is legal, this isn't the illegal side of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and everyone knows that it's putting huge pressure on the housing market. An extraordinary percentage of the housing deficit that we currently have in this country is a result of mass migration. The migration we saw, the net migration we saw between 2021 and 2024 actually meant that we would have had to build 1 million homes just to meet that extra demand that was
coming. And the whole of the Parliament, Angela Rayner, we'll talk about her in a second, the whole of the Parliament, 1.5 million, is the target, which I don't think they're going to meet at all. Well, earlier on, the former Conservative Home Secretary, who've just been chatting about him, Sir James Cleverly, spoke to Ian Collins about the net migration figures. This is what he said.
Well, the ONS themselves have made it very clear that the big areas of reduction are as a direct result of people coming here on work visas and people coming here as students not being able to bring family members with them anymore. That was a big driver to the increase in figures, and that's why these figures have come down. And those changes I put in place when I was Home Secretary. When Rishi Sunak moved me from the Foreign Office, he made it clear that his expectation of me as a new Home Secretary was to bring these immigration figures down. So I worked with other government departments, I worked with the Treasury, I had his backing and support. We brought these changes in. I was criticised by Labour at the time, but now we're seeing that they worked. And had the Labour government continued to implement the policies that I put in place, we would see these figures come down even further in the future, but they haven't.
So James Cleverly saying that his argument anyway is that the thing that has brought this down, still to a very high level of 431,000, those things have now been stopped under Labour, and Labour's plan, you think, Robert, isn't going to work.
Yeah, so a big thing that Labour did do when they assumed office was they actually did reverse some of the plans that the Conservative Party had put into train regarding the family members and the family member threshold. There had to be a certain earnings threshold before family members could come over. They've reversed that. We saw the white paper. I think the best estimate, best case scenario, is that would bring down immigration by about 98,000 visas per year, which of course would still leave us with about 850,000 visas being handed out every single year, which would, again, unless we're doing anything to increase the emigration from the country as well, in terms of kind of making sure that those on student visas are actually leaving the country, those on work visas are actually leaving the country, then we will continue to see incredibly high numbers such as this. And, you know, I would have liked to have seen a bit more contrition from James Cleverly. I think some Conservatives have recognised that under the Conservative watch, that if things really did get out of hand, I think Robert Jenrick and Suella Braverman are both prepared to put their hands up and say, look, our party really dropped the ball on this. I don't think this is really something that the Conservative Party should be trying to claim any credit
about. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
It's kind of
it's still a very high number, isn't it? I mean, 431, it may have almost halved, but still, that's a huge number. What do you think the net migration number should be? And within that, we're talking about people leaving and staying, and there are problems and worries about a brain drain, the wrong people, in inverted commas, arriving, the right people who are highly skilled leaving and moving to many other places.
Well, this is a big problem. Of course, fortunately, a lot of the emigration that we are seeing is those that have kind of come in on low-skilled workers or student visas, leaving at the end of that period. So about 70% of those that do leave the country aren't British. They're kind of foreign nationals that have come to the end of their visa. But I think really the problem is that sort of politicians have been captured by quangos and businesses and kind of and
government departments, places like the Treasury, the Health Department, for example, saying, the Business Department saying we need all these people to come in. It's always a battle within the Home Office for lots of other parts of the country. I remember when Theresa May was Home Secretary, she would privately say that actually, she wanted migration to come down. It was lots of other people around the cabinet table saying we need these migrants.
Well, and absolutely, and May was right on that regard. And the British public have reached a point now where immigration is the #1 issue in the the country. About 70% of the country think that immigration has been too high. About 46% of the country want either immigration at net zero, which is the Reform Party policy, or they want it actually in the minus figure. So this is where the British public are moving. This talk of kind of, oh, if we can hit 250,000, then that would be a huge success, really, I think, reflects the disconnect the politicians and the British public have at this moment in time. There's politicians that, as we were just saying, are kind of captured by this groupthink that takes place within government departments, the businesses, the quangos, and they're unable to see, actually, that the British public have just simply had enough at this point.
Let's talk about the story about Angela Rayner in the Telegraph today. She, behind the scenes, urging the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, to consider restricting access to the state pension for recently arrived migrants. She also suggested making it harder for immigrants to gain access to universal credit, raising the fee they must pay for using the NHS. Not what I had in my bingo card in regard to Angela Rayner, it must be said. Has this surprised you?
It has a bit, and I think we are seeing kind of certain Labour politicians recognising the threat that is being posed on the right flank because of this issue. And there's a big difference between talking in these terms and, of course, those that are able to come to this country, those foreign nationals that are coming to this country and claiming universal credit after only being here for really 5 years is the point at which you qualify for those, has really got out of hand. We've got 1 million foreign-born individuals in this country claiming some form of working age benefit as well. So this is the kind of scale of the problem, and I think it is right to address these problems and to talk about them. The problem is, will their deeds actually match their words? And it's all very well and good kind of putting this stuff out there, and it's, a bit of red meat, which we saw a lot with the Conservative Party as well, but will they actually do anything that makes this issue better, solves this issue, and starts putting us back on a more sensible track? And I don't think they will. So, as far as I'm concerned, the Labour Party can continue talking in these terms and continue the inaction that we are seeing at the moment, and it's only feeding one political party, and that's one on the right of the political spectrum.
Certainly. Robert, thank you very much indeed. That's Robert Bates there, who's Research Director at the Centre for Migration Control. If you have thoughts on what he has said, 0344 499 1000. Joanna's been in touch on text and says, "Hi Cardi P, I'm sick of headlines like Angela Rayner saying to reduce migrant benefits. It's just an empty headline to make us feel as if they might do something. They have no intention of doing anything. Just like the winter fuel payment, Starmer is trying to disguise the face pensioners, or the fact pensioners are going to be taxed next year for not raising the tax allowance, and is signing with the EU deal will increase fossil fuel prices and nail us to net zero charges." We will continue to discuss all of this next here on Talk. We're also going to talk to Jonathan Saccardoti about those horrendous murders in Washington DC of 2 Israeli embassy officials. Stay with us here on Talk.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
We're going to talk now about those horrendous murders in Washington DC of 2 Israeli embassy officials who were shot because they're Jewish and because they worked for Israel by someone shouting, "Free, free Palestine." When you say things like globalise the Intifada, when these horrendous words on anti-Semitism happen, well, there is an effect, and we're going to talk to Jonathan Sacerdoti in just a second about that. Earlier, the Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Saar spoke at a press conference. Let's take a look at his warnings about future attacks.
I have been worried for the past few months that something like this would happen. This is the direct result of toxic anti-Semitic incitement against Israel and Jews around the world that has been going on since the October 7th massacre. Recently, we have witnessed an unprecedented wave of terror attacks and attempts against Israeli missions around the world, with an emphasis on Europe. There is a direct line connecting anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli incitement to this murder. This incitement is also done by leaders and officials of many countries and international organizations, especially from Europe. These libels about genocide, crimes against humanity, and murdering babies paved the way exactly for such murders. This is what happens when leaders in the world surrender to the Palestinian terrorist propaganda and serve it. The statements and attacks blame Israel instead of Hamas.
Fascinating. I think he had the word Starmer in his mind. I think he had the word Lammy in his mind. I don't know, but I wonder what Jonathan Sacerdoti thinks. He's a journalist and broadcaster who has an outstanding article on the Spectator website today. The headline is "The Washington Shooting is a Chilling Warning to Jews Everywhere." Jonathan, even by your usual standards, this was an absolutely superb article. I'm going to tweet it out in the next break, and I want people to go on my Twitter at Peter Cardwell and have a read of it. There are loads of things that you raise, and I want to talk through those, Jonathan. But first of all, I want your reaction to Gideon Saar, because I was just looking at the different timings, even just a really straightforward thing on the different timings. Simon Harris, the Taoiseach in Ireland, condemned what happened in Washington at 7:10 this morning with a tweet. Emmanuel Macron condemning what happened in Washington, 9:48 a.m. Keir Starmer's first tweet was about returning 30,000 people after the election, 12% more than the last government. It took him until this afternoon to actually tweet about what happened in Washington. And many people will notice that, many people will see that. And as your article brilliantly points out, it's sometimes those subtle things, the Jewish people often the frog in the pot in regard to anti-Semitism and in regard to what is happening in our society. Tell me your thoughts today, Jonathan.
Well, firstly, thank you for your kind words about the article. And, you know, it's always flattering when people do tell me that something I wrote resonated. But I must say, it's really depressing that I find now cause to write so often on these sorts of topics. And that's where that piece came from. It really came from deep in my heart or in my soul. It's my inner being. It's everything I'm on this planet to do as a journalist. And I don't mean to sound too grand saying stuff like that, because ultimately, I'm sitting writing things that I and many other Jewish people are thinking. And all I can say is nothing about this shooting was a surprise, because I, like the Foreign Minister of Israel there, have seen this coming, not just for months, as he said, actually for years. This constant drip, drip, drip of anti-Israel propaganda put out by Hamas and other Palestinian factions, but so readily adopted by the left-wing media, the mainstream media in general. Governments can't just blame the Labour government we have now. Even David Cameron, when he was Foreign Secretary, and in years before that, said outrageous things about Israel and the conflict with the Palestinians. This is just something that really has to end, because this is the logical consequence of what happens if you constantly tell a whole new generation of people who don't know very much about the history and the conflict that Israel, the Jewish state, effectively Jews, are Nazis, are killing babies for sport, for hobby, for fun, that they are starving people deliberately to try and torture them. All of these lies, all of these blood libels, all of these calumnies about the Jewish state and Jews will, of course, lead people to carrying out violence on Jews. And it's so important that we can say they're not true. They're lies. They're deliberate lies. And people are either spreading them intentionally, or they are moronically spreading them because they think it will get them off the hook from the same enemy, or because they simply don't know better. But none of those excuses are good enough when we end up with people being killed in this way yet again.
What I'd really like my fellow journalists to do, what I'd really like them to do, is just apply the same standards to Jewish people and to Israel as they do to other nations. So I wouldn't trust Wikipedia, for example. So I check everything that I put on air that I've seen on Wikipedia. I go to the source and make sure it's correct. That's basic journalism. It would be really good if people said Hamas are telling us what these figures of deaths are in Gaza. I'm not saying for a second that people aren't dying in Gaza. I'm not saying that there's not a humanitarian crisis there. Of course there is. But when it comes to words like genocide, for example, as you say in your article, which is thrown around, it was thrown around by Trump yesterday in regard to South Africa, it's been thrown around by many, many people in regard to what Israel is doing. And actually, I'm actually just going to read this paragraph from your article. The virus is spread throughout the media and into ordinary society. Consider this week's now infamous claim that 14,000 babies in Gaza were at imminent risk of death by starvation within 2 days, a figure so implausible, so grotesquely inflated that it should have collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity. And yet it didn't. Major news outlets repeated it. Activists shouted it, shared it as gospel, as if numbers so apocalyptic required no scrutiny at all. That number, as you know far better than I do, Jonathan, did not come from Hamas. It came from the United Nations.
It's true. And when you try and explain to a wider population who aren't interested necessarily in this topic or don't know a lot about it, they assume, understandably, that something called the United Nations, something with that mission, is this purer than pure, whiter than white, dedicated to humanitarian cause and not at all polluted by politics, supranational organisation. But it's not true. If you just think about which nations are united in it, so many of them are not democracies. So many of them stated aims against countries like Israel, against other democracies. So many of them openly hate Jewish people. So it's not really a fair arbiter of anything. And when it puts out such outrageous claims as that and has spokespeople or people high up in that organisation say those things out on the airwaves, it isn't enough just to say, well, I heard the UN say it. Too often, the UN is relying on corrupted bodies on the ground in Gaza, for example. Too often, there is speculation and it's then twisted and misrepresented even by their own people. Each one of us has the ability for critical thinking. Everyone listening or watching this right now has the ability for critical thinking. Every journalist has not just the ability, but the responsibility for critical thinking. And sure, we can all make mistakes. We can all get sources wrong. But 14,000 babies dying in the next 2 days from this overblown claim of famine and starvation, which is inaccurate. Yes, it's correct to say that in this brutal and complex war zone, there may be some issues of shortage and need, there may even be some hunger, but there is very little conclusive proof of that being widespread, of that causing anything like the disaster that was being predicted there, and certainly not in that time frame. And I would say that any journalist that picked up that number and ran with it, and any independent citizen who literally did not have their head screwed on, because it was such a stupid and outrageous claim. It was so obviously wrong, and even the UN then reeled it back, and it was revealed that they were talking about what could happen with signs of hunger within a year if the current levels were the same or got worse. That's a very different prospect, and even that is dubious, but a very different prospect from what they put out there. I really think that people need to get real. They need to get over themselves. They need to get over these lies, these misrepresentations. And I say it with the utmost seriousness. It's time. It's time. It's been 80 years since the last time there was this mechanized and international attempt to wipe out Jews. But for many of us, it really does truly feel like something horribly sinister is starting again. And I said in that article, and I'll say it here, you know, if we're looking to stop the next version of what happened back then in my father's youth, then we need not look for swastikas and jackboots. We need to look for the modern day representations, the modern day little symbols in ordinary society, the people we live among, the people we live next to, the things they're permitting, the things they're maybe even doing, which are actually facilitating this rising widening wave of hatred against Jews, and it goes from the ground, from the street upwards, into schools, into classrooms, into medical clinics, into the BBC, into other news broadcasters, other news outlets, Sky News, all of these places. They need to look at what they're doing. This is serious. Okay. It's not a game, and it's not about getting scoops and making big stories. It's about real lives and what they're doing to put Jewish people at risk.
What would you say to those who cite things such as the words of the Israeli finance minister, for example, talking about cleansing Gaza? I support the Israeli people. I do not support the Israeli government and a lot of what it is doing, although some of it I do support. There are some people who think, and I've been guilty of it myself, of thinking that sometimes the Israeli government is its own worst enemy in some of the things it says and some of the things it does. It can be a difficult dance for people to continue to support the Israeli people when sometimes those things are thrown in our face and we see some of the humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in Gaza. How would you tackle that issue, Jonathan?
I think there's a few things to separate out there, and I know that in programmes like this time is short, so I'll do my best. I'll say that all democratic governments, and Israel is a healthy democracy, some might say too healthy and too democratic, it will have people that say stupid things, even in power, even in cabinets. Our own country provides plenty of examples of that. Our own Foreign Secretary, in my opinion, it has provided plenty in the last few days, and morally reprehensible and inexcusable things that he said, particularly about Israel. And I will say also that not everything that every politician says is correct, but similarly not everything that every Israeli politician says, even in high-up positions in the cabinet, because of their coalition system, is necessarily actually the policy that's put into action during the war. So what's going on in Gaza is not necessarily reflected by even those most outrageous statements that you could find from some of the most extreme people in the Israeli government. Now, that's not me excusing the things they say, but it is me saying, look for what's actually happening. And I will say that there is, as far as I can see, no evidence of this sort of mass cleansing, this sinister plot to try to wipe out children, targeting of civilians. All of those things are untrue. It's difficult for us to prove them because there are doubts over numbers that come out from Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and there is no way for most journalists to get in. I accept all of those things, but that doesn't mean that we can just run with the lies of the terrorists and make things up, especially when those things often seem to fall in the line of blood libels and calumnies about Jewish people and Israel, which only feed the worst instincts that some people have because they've been primed for this stuff for decades. So I would say that all of those things are important to keep in mind.
And I do think the Israeli government and the Egyptian government actually should change their mind and should let journalists into Gaza so they can do independent reporting. Priti Patel has told our colleagues on Times Radio, she's of course the Shadow Foreign Secretary, she believes the UK's joint statement with France and Canada about Israel's conduct in the war against Hamas was completely unhelpful and provoked a reaction from a terrorist organisation, referring to the killing of 2 Israeli diplomats in Washington DC. That's just happened in the last few minutes over on Times Radio. Our colleagues there reporting that. Jonathan, what do you make of Priti Patel's comments?
Listen, Priti Patel's often had her head screwed on quite right about matters to do with Israel, and I'm perfectly happy to say that, because I think that unfortunately politicians in this country who are willing to think straight and then say it out loud are actually quite rare. I can't necessarily tell you if the killer in DC was literally part of a terror group or anything like that, but it seems fairly obvious from what we're starting to learn about him that he was a well-seasoned, signed-up member of some far-left organisations and groups in the US, and that, you know, those phrases that came out of his mouth that we heard him shout and that eyewitnesses reported, free Palestine and Intifada, as he was led away, having killed those 2 people outside the Jewish Museum, he didn't make those phrases up. I've heard them week in, week out in this country, on our streets, even on our television screens projected onto Big Ben from the river to the sea. All of these things are leading towards what we saw there. And let me say, it didn't take October the 7th, and it didn't even take the last 18 months of these so-called hate marches to bring it about. Jews were killed outside the Jewish Museum in Brussels some years ago. Jews were held hostage and killed in the Hypercacher supermarket in France. I reported from there. Jews are being killed all over Europe for many years. Jews have been shot in a Jewish school in Toulouse not that many years ago. Jews are still the targets for Islamic terrorism. And what is so tragic is that the far left has made this unholy alliance with Jews, and that you will find people that are so committed to these so-called social justice causes, who are so dedicated to signalling what they consider to be their virtue in looking out for these so-called human rights abuses, which simply are over-exaggerated or not happening at all. And all of this feels so conveniently like it can be fit right onto Israel, the Jewish state. I'm sorry, so many Jewish people in this country, and I really urge people who maybe don't agree with me just to listen to it and hear it. I don't often sound this urgent or depressed or miserable about this stuff, but I get written to by Jews every single day because of the pieces I write and because of the broadcasts I do. I hear from such a wide range of people around the world. Some do disagree with me, but the vast majority, Jewish and non-Jewish, write to me quietly and say, I hear what you're saying, this is utterly depressing. The world needs to wake up. The world needs to do something about this, and we are right there with you. If this is true, that there is a silent majority who agree with what I'm saying and with what Jewish people are feeling, it's time they stop being silent. It's time every Jew stop being silent, every non-Jew stop being silent. We have to speak up against this because too many people are dying, and there is too much of this going on year after year after year.
Jonathan, thank you. That's Jonathan Sacerdoti, journalist and broadcaster. And one of the things you can do, whether you're Jewish or not, is go to my Twitter at Peter Cardwell. In the next couple of minutes during the break, I'm going to tweet Jonathan's article. Read it, like it, retweet it, make sure that the people who follow you on Twitter read it too, because it is a really important piece of journalism on a really dark day in regard to what happened in Washington, D.C. We're not forgetting for a second the incredible humanitarian crisis there is in Gaza. It needs to be solved. The Jewish people around the world and Israeli people in Israel need our support too. They're under attack. I actually got a direct message from someone on Twitter who's there talking about a rocket attack at 3 o'clock in the morning where she is. There's so much to this, and we need to make sure we're informed, and as Jonathan correctly says, that we engage our critical faculties. Get the facts, then make a decision. Lots to talk about here on Talk. I want your reaction to what Jonathan said, and we're also going to talk in just a second about the UK signing a deal to hand over the Chagos Islands, but guess what? The courts have stopped it. Fascinating story. Stay with us.
Agree. But the point is, they have now demonstrated to the world in this negotiation, as in so many others, that under any kind of pressure, they roll over. This is a really, really negative signal they're sending to the world. Just as we're seeing with a U-turn on winter fuel allowance, because their backbenchers got a little bit shirty, Keir Starmer and the Labour government do not have the resolve to act in the national best interest.
across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, as promised, I have retweeted that, and you can go onto my Twitter at Peter Cardwell. Please share that article and read it from Jonathan Sacerdoti. Let's go to Theo Usherwood now, political commentator. There's a big story. The UK has signed the deal to hand over the Chagos Islands, but there was a legal drama earlier today. They're going to lease back the military base for £101 million a year. Theo, just talk us through what's happened in the last 24 hours.
Well, the deal's finally been signed, but as you say, 11th hour drama at the Royal Courts of Justice in central London after a legal challenge was brought by two Chagosian women who are, of course, British citizens, but they brought this legal challenge which ran until 2 o'clock, just before 2:30 this morning, where they were making the argument to a High Court judge that they weren't going to be able to return as freely as they might like to the Chagos Islands once they'd been handed over to Mauritius because of this deal, as you say, from the British government to hand the Chagos Islands back to Mauritius. The argument from the government is that they need to do so following an international court ruling that it was necessary, and should that be taken to a court where they could provide a binding ruling, it would go against them. They brought this legal challenge at 2 o'clock in the morning. The High Court judge found in their favour by granting an interim injunction, Peter, and so we're all back at the High Court at 10 o'clock, 10:30, to hear whether they were going to uphold this injunction and prevent Keir Starmer from signing his deal. In the end, the High Court judge relented, dropped the injunction, and the deal's just been signed this afternoon between Keir Starmer and the Mauritian government. John Healey in the House of Commons to take questions from MPs, and it's got over the line. But for many Chagosians living here in Britain, this is a rum deal because, of course, it means that they are no longer able to freely travel between Chagos and Great Britain.
Let's see what Keir Starmer has said about this. Earlier he announced the deal had been signed. This is the Prime Minister's thoughts on this.
So there's no alternative but to act in Britain's national interest. By agreeing to this deal now on our terms, we're securing strong protections, including from malign influence, that will allow the base to operate well into the next century, helping to keep us safe for generations to come. Now, other approaches to secure the base have been tried over the years, and they have failed. Boris Johnson failed in his efforts to endlessly delay. Liz Truss then started the negotiations. We inherited a negotiation in which the principle of giving up UK sovereignty had already been conceded by the previous Tory government. Our deal has concluded those negotiations in the national interest.
Well, clearly there are some Chagosians who are not happy about that. Just hearing the arguments today, and I know there have been Chagosians who've been part of that legal action, what were their arguments essentially, Theo?
Their arguments was to go back to the fact that this is a British overseas, or was a British overseas territory. They belong to Britain, and that they valued the right to be able to travel between Britain and the Chagosian archipelago in the Indian Ocean. It was something that they valued, and they valued their rights to live here in Britain, just as they valued their rights to be Chagosians. They didn't want to cede those rights to Mauritius. They didn't think that the Mauritian government would uphold their own interests. Of course, Diego Garcia, this is what Keir Starmer was referring to, is a key strategic military base for both the United States and for the UK. It's a launch point for operations right across the Middle East and the Far East. Keir Starmer pointing out that if he hadn't signed this deal, then it would have allowed potentially China to set up eavesdropping. This is the argument from the government, eavesdropping bases on other islands within the archipelago to spy on that key strategic base that the United States and the UK value so highly. But there is and this was actually mentioned by a couple of the Chagosians I spoke to, who said we shouldn't be spending, it's £101 million a year to rent, to lease the Chagos Islands back from Mauritius, particularly Diego Garcia, but we shouldn't be doing that, because that money, and this was the argument from the Chagosians, should be spent on people in this country. And this is why, Keir Starmer was at pains there. You heard him, didn't you? Pains to make the point that this is a deal that he has had to take in the national interest, and that it was the idea of Liz Truss and the previous Conservative government, that negotiation that started under the previous Prime Minister. Because, of course, there'll be many Labour voters, maybe Reform voters, who think, well, actually, that money, which could total as much as £9 billion a year, people have put it even higher, £99 billion over the course of the deal. Some people have put it as high as £18 billion, depending on how inflation goes over the course of the deal. But their argument was that money could be much better spent in this country on dealing with things like homelessness
and a lot of people will make that argument. Theo, thank you. That's Theo Usherwood down at the Royal Court of Justice. James Cleverly, the former Home Secretary, Sir James Cleverly, also spoke about the Chagos deal with Ian Collins a little bit earlier today. Let's just remind ourselves what Sir James Cleverly was saying.
Well, they keep saying, oh, no, those are not on the table. But the point is, they have now demonstrated to the world in this negotiation, as in so many others, that under any kind of pressure, they roll over. This is a really, really negative signal they're sending to the world. Just as we're seeing with a U-turn on winter fuel allowance, because their backbenchers got a little bit shirty, Keir Starmer and the Labour government do not have the resolve to act in the national best interest. All our adversaries, competitors around the world can sense that, and it's going to make maintaining Britain's interests around the world a whole load harder, because the whole world has seen that Keir Starmer rolls over at the first sign of pressure.
Sir James Cleverly speaking to Ian Collins about this. Interesting from Andy, he's been in touch and said, I really want to know why this was necessary. No one has ever explained this, and Starmer's speech just then didn't either. Well, they've talked about security, they've talked about the Americans, they've talked about it, but really I think it's just Foreign Office pressure. Interestingly, Dominic Cummings, who was the chief advisor to Boris Johnson, of course, he said it was totally unnecessary. Foreign Office wanted them to do it and they said no, although of course Sir Keir Starmer saying that it was the Conservatives who sort of seeded the idea and they were just implementing the policy. Well, they didn't have to. They didn't have to do that necessarily. We're going to talk to David Gauke in just a minute. He is the former Justice Secretary and he's the one who's come up with all these ideas to reform the justice system. It'll be interesting to talk to him as a former Lord Chancellor and Justice Secretary advising the Labour government, which seemed to have taken on quite a few of his ideas. We'll talk to him in just a minute here on Talk.
the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Good evening, this is Talk Drive. I'm Peter Cardwell. Thank you so much for your company. There's lots to talk about in the next couple of hours, including the big review of the justice system by David Gauke. He is the former Justice Secretary for the Conservatives, but now he's advising the Labour government on what to do. Chemical castration for paedophiles is the headline, certainly, that many have gone with, but there's a lot in it. It's in regard to getting rid of short sentences, for example, and how long big offenders, repeat offenders, actually spend on our streets. Part of it as well. We'll talk to David Gauke in just a second. We'll get your views on it as well, 0344 499 1000. A little bit later on, we're going to talk about UK net migration falling. Ben Habib will be with us. It's still 431,000 people net per year, but Angela Rayner, surprisingly to me anyway, has called for a curb on migrant benefits behind the scenes. We'll get a sports update this hour as well, and later on we'll talk about the South African president in the Oval Office. Big breaking story about this time yesterday. Well, what is actually happening to those white farmers in South Africa? Did Donald Trump have a point, and how should we react to it here in this country? Lots to discuss here on Talk. I want to make sure that you get your voice on the air. 0344 499 1000 is the number to call. I'll definitely take calls this hour. We didn't have time last hour, very unfortunately, but I'll make sure that the many people who've called in get their voice on the air. As I say, 0344 499 1000. You can text me 87222 with the word talk in your text. You can tweet me at talkTV. Follow me at Peter Cardwell. Send me a voice note, send me a WhatsApp text message, or give me a ring on the main number 0344 499 1000. Loads to discuss. Let's have the conversation together here on Talk. Well, a big day politically for lots of reasons. Migration we're going to talk about. Certainly those numbers have come through, but the justice system is something we return to time and time again. You may know I was a special advisor in government. David's successor, Robert Buckland, was my boss, and for 6 months I advised him as a special advisor. Sentencing, the prison system, the courts, probation, all those issues, really, really difficult, never a silver bullet. But David Gauke, a very thoughtful man, someone who I don't always agree with politically, but someone who has clear views on the justice system, a lot of experience. He's come up with a range of proposals for the Labour government, despite the fact he was a Conservative previously. Well, the Justice Secretary, Shabnam Mahmood, has set out plans on lots of this, including perhaps the most headline-grabbing thought of David Gauke's on chemical castration. This is what the Justice Secretary said earlier today in the House of Commons.
I also asked the review to consider how we manage sex offenders. The review has recommended we continue a pilot of so-called medication to manage problematic sexual arousal. I will go further, with a national rollout beginning in 2 regions covering 20 prisons, and I am exploring whether mandating the approach is possible. Of course, it is vital that this approach is taken alongside psychological interventions that target other causes of offending, like asserting power and control.
Shabnam Mahmood there, the current Justice Secretary. She also explained the changes to shorter sentences proposed by her predecessor David Gauke and what good behaviour could actually lead to.
Under this model, an offender will not necessarily leave prison at an automatic point. Instead, their release date will be determined by their behaviour. If they follow prison rules, they will earn earlier release. If they do not, they will be locked up for longer. This echoes the model I witnessed in Texas earlier this year, which cut crime and brought their prison population under control.
Well, David Gauke was the chairman of the Independent Sentencing Review. Former Justice Secretary himself joins me now. David, good evening.
Good evening.
There's a lot that's controversial in this. I wonder if we could talk, first of all, about the thoughts that you have had on chemical castration. This is recommending that killers, rapists and other sexual and violent offenders are freed halfway through their sentences. That's one element of this. But specifically in regard to paedophiles, chemical castration is something that you've developed your thoughts on. Just give us your thoughts on that specific point.
So the recommendation from the review panel was that we currently have a pilot into what I would describe as chemical suppressants, but essentially drugs that reduce sexual desire, that this would be on a voluntary basis, and that it could play a role not with every sex offender, but particularly with those where the offending behaviour as a result of a sexual desire. And so one could see that, for example, those who view child pornography are falling within that category. This is something that we already do a limited amount of. I think it is worth exploring more widely. There are other jurisdictions that do much more of this. So I would argue that what we are setting out is a reasonable measure to take for the purposes of building evidence and building the case for that. Obviously, as you've seen, the Justice Secretary is looking to go further and faster than that. But as I say, there are plenty of jurisdictions that make use of these drugs. And if we can take away those desires and what is described by the psychiatrists as sexual preoccupation, where that's resulting in criminal behavior or has resulted in criminal behavior, that might be something that could be used to reduce future risk of reoffending. And I do think it's worth looking at.
I want to talk about the most serious offenders, and I mean, all crime is serious, but those who have done crimes that are lesser. The review recommends that killers, rapists and other serious sexual and violent offenders are freed halfway through their sentences rather than 2/3 if they engage with rehabilitative schemes and obey prison rules. This is something that I sort of wrestle with slightly. Some will see this as rewarding people for their behaviour within prison. Is that something we should be doing to incentivise them? Or should they just be banged up and the key thrown away? Because there is a scale of this, isn't there?
Yeah. Can we just be clear in terms of what happens here with sentencing? And I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Where an offender is identified by the courts as being dangerous, they fall into one particular regime, which is about extended determinate sentences. And there, what happens at the moment is that you get a parole board hearing 2/3 of the way through your sentence. What we recommended, this is actually not something that the government is taking forward, is that if you behave well, you could bring that parole board hearing forward to halfway through your sentence. There's another category of offender that are not identified as being dangerous, but nonetheless, they have committed a serious offence. They have got a sentence of more than 4 years, and it's a sexual violence offence. Now, traditionally, the release date for those offenders has always been halfway through, at least in recent years. Then, a few years ago, there was a change to make that 2/3. And our recommendation there is simply that if they have behaved well, they are released halfway through. If they don't, then they're released later on. It's not really a radical change. It's essentially going back to the position at best, or at most, if you like, as to what the regime was 5 years ago. So it's not a dramatic change in that sense. And remember, Peter, really the point about where you punish people is in the original sentence, rather than moving around the release dates. So I apologise, that's a sort of slightly...
No, it's helpful, and it explains the issue.
Provide the background to that.
But there will be many who see not that particular part of what you're recommending, but another part of it, that will see people who've committed very serious crimes being sentenced for, say, 10 years, but getting out after 3 years and 4 months, 1/3 of their sentence. Now, they're obviously serving some of that sentence in the community, but the time that people spend behind bars is what so many people focus on. There's so many delays in the court system, and even when those sentences are given, many people and many victims of crime will be very worried, I would imagine, that simply because of the pressure in the prison system, people will, under your proposals, serve less time behind bars. What would you say to them?
Look, I think there's a really important point here, and I'm going to agree with the concern at one level, which is that very often we're not clear when sentences happen what is actually going to happen. So your example, when we hear someone is going to say, sentenced to 10 years, And people understandably conclude that they're going to be in prison for 10 years. But that's not true. That's not what the system is designed to do. System is generally designed for people to be released in those circumstances after 5 years. It's 5 years in prison and then 5 years on license in the community. That's actually recently moved to 4 years because of prison overcrowding. And so I think there is a case for much more honesty and transparency in sentencing, so that we are clear this is the minimum period of time that somebody will spend in prison. And the new structure that we are recommending, that the government are going to take forward, is to say that in a normal case where people have behaved, you have a third which is going to be in custody. A third of your sentence is going to be in the community, but very closely supervised. That may well mean an electronic tag. It may well mean curfews. It may well mean detention at home, so that in fact you're in, house arrest, if you like.
Although the monitoring of that, of course, is a big burden as well, isn't it?
Apologies, Simon?
The monitoring of all of that is a big burden as well on the system.
It is, but we recommend that it is worth investing in that. The government recognises that, I'm pleased to say. So proper investment in electronic tagging. There's an awful lot that can be done that I think will be more reassuring for the public, actually ensures that the public is properly protected. It's important that we get this right. It is important that we are prepared to expand the electronic tagging system, but I think that can play an important role in our system.
How much of this could have been avoided in your review? How much of what the detail and the issues that you're actually dealing with, David, could have been avoided if the Conservatives under 14 years, and I was in the Ministry of Justice for 6 months, had just built many, many more prison places and just done what they should have done in the first place?
Look, the government, there is a point here which is necessity. There just simply aren't the prison places. We cannot get ourselves into a position where we run out of places. We don't want to see a repeat. I don't think any of us want to see a repeat of emergency early releases. So much better to address this in a systemic, strategic way, which is what we're recommending. Could we have, if we'd built more over the last 14 years? Yes, you could say that would be true, but let's not forget our prison population has already grown very rapidly. The prison population in 1993 was 44,000. Today it's 88,000, so it's doubled over that time. Our incarceration rate, the number of people in prison per 100,000, in the Netherlands it's 64, in Germany it's 68. In England and Wales, it's 139. We do put a lot of people in prison, and every additional prison place to build costs £500,000, and then to operate costs, on average at the moment, £54,000. So there is a question from the point of view of the hard-pressed taxpayer: how much do we want to spend on prisons?
But even within your recommendations, David, where will the extra funding come from, or should it come from, to allow probation to conduct this extra supervision you're talking about? They're already at breaking point.
Well, you're right to say we are explicitly calling for more investment in probation, and I'm pleased that Shabana Mahmood has announced that is going to happen. The point I would make here is the average cost, as I said, per prison place is £54,000 a year. The average cost to supervise somebody in probation is more like £3,000 or £4,000. There's an awful lot more that you can do in terms of spending money with probation than you can do with prisons. Prisons are very expensive. And perhaps more importantly here, let's not forget, when it comes to reducing reoffending, if we want to be reducing crime, there is evidence to show that effective community sentences can be much more effective than putting people into prison, and where we have a very high reoffending rate for those who come out of prison.
Well, let's talk a little bit about those community sentences and about the issue of short sentences. Now, when you were Justice Secretary, one of the things you wanted to do was sort of end or curb anyway those short sentences. What would you say to people who are perhaps a shop owner, for example, or someone who's been burgled, or someone who has been a victim of theft? You know, there are people who have multiple, sometimes dozens of convictions, and it takes a very long time in the system for those lesser crimes. I'm sorry to say that. If you're a victim of crime, it feels dreadful no matter what it is. But Robert Jenrick, for example, the Shadow Justice Secretary, has said by scrapping short prison sentences, Starmer is effectively decriminalising crimes like burglary, theft and assault. This is a gift to criminals who will be free to offend with impunity. I wonder what you make of that, and also what you would say to those people who perhaps see a repeat offender who's given a slap on the wrist or a community sentence, or something that doesn't actually involve going to prison. There is definitely an argument about 3-month prison sentences, 6 months prison sentences. What do they actually achieve? But if you're a victim of crime, you want that perpetrator locked up.
So a few points in response to that. First of all, what is really important in terms of deterring crime is enforcement, is people being arrested, charged and convicted. That process has to happen. And we are certainly not advocating decriminalisation in that sense. The second point I would make is let's look at the evidence of the effectiveness of short sentences. And I'm afraid the story is not good. Reoffending rates are very, very high in that context. And part of the reason for that is what we know helps rehabilitation is having a home, having a job and strong family ties. Putting somebody in prison for a few weeks or a few months it will only damage that. If people have got a home, they may well lose it. If they've got a job, they'll most certainly lose that. Family ties are also put under strain. So it doesn't work for that reason. The second, our most prolific offenders, the people who go back and shoplift again and again and again, almost invariably they are doing that to fund a drug habit or alcoholism. And what we have to do is, as far as we possibly can, try to address that. Community sentences can be more effective in that. We advocate greater use of treatment in the community. And overall, there are better opportunities to address that in the community than within prison. One of the things we argue for is greater use of intensive supervision courts. These are sometimes called problem-solving courts, where we use the authority of the judge to put pressure on the individual offender, to monitor what they are doing, to have regular meetings, checking in, making sure that all the agencies that are designed to deal with this come together and address it. So I think there is a real case in terms of rehabilitation. And what most victims want is for the criminality to stop.
Yeah.
So someone doesn't go back and shoplift, whether for them or someone else.
Okay.
And we have to ask ourselves, what's the best way in which we can do that?
Thank you, David Gawke. Appreciate that. He is chairman of the Independent Sentencing Review. What do you think of what he said there? Jane's been in touch and says a third of the sentence. Lucy Connolly has already served a third. She should be out. I think she shouldn't be in at all. But what do you make of the different ideas that David Gawke has put forward there? Let me know your thoughts. 0344 499 1000. John in Rugby says, good afternoon, Peter. Castration for convicted paedophiles? No. Capital punishment? Yes. Job done. Sorted, says John. Well, I don't agree with capital punishment. I don't think it should happen. I don't think it's civilised. I don't think it's a good idea. But maybe you think I'm wrong, and that's okay, because on this programme we disagree without being disagreeable. 0344 499 1000. We're going to talk to Ben Habib next about the immigration statistics and about these issues in regard to the justice system and about the UK signing the deal to hand over the Chagos Islands. Was it a surrender? Stay with us here on Talk.
Well, the ONS themselves have made it very clear that the big areas of reduction are as a direct result of people coming here on work visas and people coming here as students not being able to bring family members with them anymore. That was a big driver to the increase in figures, and that's why these figures have come down. And those changes I put in place when I was Home Secretary.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, thanks to everybody who's been in touch. Darren has some thoughts on the state of Britain and sent us a voice note on 0344 499 1000. This is what Darren thinks.
Best way to describe this government is like a golfer. He drives for show and he putts for dough. But the problem is this government has done too much driving into the rough, all over the place. I've not even got onto the green yet. All this virtue signalling, saying they're going to put more into MOD spending, 2027, that will get kicked down the road. Reversing on the pensioners, that'll never happen. And now saying they're going to castrate people. It just won't happen. It's just virtue signalling nonsense just to get their ratings back up.
I think a lot of that's very true. Certainly, my view, Darren, and I think we probably agree on this, is that the government has seen the threat from Reform UK. It's realised they're struggling in the polls and they've got to do something. They think, anyway. They think they're going to solve immigration with their ideas on that. I don't think that's going to happen. They think that they're going to solve the prison issue with what they've discussed with David Gauke. That is a much bigger issue. David Gauke's a really intelligent guy. Like, he's got some good ideas there. There's some ideas I disagree with, but actually, how you turn around this country, how you turn the ship, it's very, very difficult, and I don't think Keir Starmer is going to do it. He certainly has a big task on his hands. Andy's been in touch and says, invest my money now for more prisons and prison spaces, get tougher on sentences and take more criminals off the street. Fewer criminals on the street surely means less money is needed to police the public space. There has to be a deterrent. Jenny in Oxford says, given that Starmer can't lie straight in bed, Peter, it is clear that the Chagos Islands were surrendered by the Prime Minister because he wants to look good on the international stage. Good afternoon, Peter, says Dorothy in East Kilbride. I'm disgusted by this Labour government, but the word of David Lammy in Parliament were not only the words were not only dishonest, but dangerous. Words have an effect. Shame on them all, says Dorothy from East Kilbride. Leslie also says, what a disgrace this government accepted congratulations from Hamas, a proscribed terrorist group. Shameful. Well, they didn't accept them necessarily, but they were certainly congratulated by Hamas. On the Chagos Islands, Rajat has been in touch from Harrow. Rajat, I know in that area in Harrow there are many Chagosians. I wonder what your perspective on this handover of the Chagos Islands is, Rajat.
Yes, hello, Peter. I'm a member of the Friends of the British Overseas Territories, and
okay.
I've gone to Parliament about this business quite a few times. Now, I am horrified and disgusted at this British government giving away its own territory away for the cost of roughly about 30 billion, maybe over the term, if not more. And I think that it's not just about the Chagosians and their rights that have been completely trampled on. The fact of the matter is that the British government gave Mauritius £3 million when Mauritius was given independence to cede all claim to the Chagos archipelago. And Mauritius started a bit of a lawfare in the 80s, and it didn't have to be responded to. It was only an international statement from a bunch of Chinese and Russian allied lawyers. And so the fact that Starmer is giving the Chagos Islands away is basically, I think it's mainly because of his lawyer friends, and just for the purpose of virtue signaling, like lots of people have been saying. The biggest catastrophe, as far as I'm concerned, this is a piece of territory about the size of France, that has been part of British Britain since 1814, large, gigantic marine reserve protecting all these wonderful fish, about at least 50% of British biodiversity, just given away on a total song for completely nothing, completely unnecessary, very treacherous, and Falklands and Gibraltar could be next.
Roger, I think a lot of people will agree with you. How is the community taking this?
Well, I mean, I think that the tragedy is that nobody seems to be able to do anything about it. I mean, it's kind of,
well, we had that legal attempt, certainly. That was effective with a stay for a short period of time anyway.
Yes, well, I think that people like Ross Kempsell of the Conservatives and various other people have been trying to pull strings and trying to launch various legal things against it. But now the government has kind of rushed into it. A few days after parking it, they've kind of decided, oh, no, we just want to do this. And they're completely undermining British global interest. It just has to be said, they're completely undermining British global interest, completely, totally.
Roger, I can hear the anger in your voice. I know this is an issue to which we're going to concern. Thank you. We're going to return. Thank you very much indeed for your thoughts on that. Jill's in Cornwall and has some thoughts on net migration, down to 431,000, almost halving. Still an awfully long way to go, Jill, isn't there?
Goodness sake. You know, all we've heard about of late is the amount of illegal migrants that are coming into this country. Thousands of them. And yet the government wants a pat on the back for net migration to be down. I mean, where are we coming here? Where are we going here? I mean, we've got people that have applied to come in, being told that they can't bring family and all the rest of it. They've gone through the motions. We've got people who haven't. We don't know who they are, what they want to do. They probably mean the worst thing that could happen to this country, floating in, and we're moving boats out the way so they can float in without any problems. Yeah. And we're supposed to be pleased that net migration supposedly fell. And
this is legal migration. This is not illegal migration. Legal migration still at 431,000. I mean, if you have year after year after year huge numbers of people, Jill, if you have the population of Bristol joining the country, coming to the country, setting up homes, it's going to put a load of pressure on resources. Do politicians get this? Does Starmer get this? He had a big plan on immigration he announced last week. Have you confidence that it's going to help?
No, he doesn't get this. I'll tell you about castration. I tell you what I think we should do. We should move the castration vote to somewhere else because this is ridiculous. It's not just the amount of illegal people that are floating in. It's what it's doing to our culture and what we believe in, what we support. I mean, it's changing everything to do with this country, as well as putting a huge strain on all the resources that people who have worked so hard all their lives to put money in, pay their taxes and support are now still in the background watching their own lives suffer while people who've done nothing and may not mean anything good for this country are just floating in and Keir Starmer's doing nothing. I'm sorry, it doesn't matter which way it is worded. The illegal side of the migration problem would not make me accept that net migration figures, legal figures, have dropped because we've propped it up with illegals.
Jill, thanks for your thoughts. Appreciate that from Jill in Cornwall. Claire in the Wirral has been in touch on the prison reforms, ideas anyway, put forward by the former Justice Secretary David Gauke. Were you convinced by what he said, Claire?
Well, to be quite hi
there.
Peter. I mean, to be quite honest, I've never been convinced about, prisoners getting out for good behaviour, because to me it's pretty ridiculous. I mean, okay, they'll behave well while they're in prison. They won't misbehave with their duties. They could be a model prisoner, but it doesn't mean they're going to be a model citizen when they come out. Prisoners are in prison for, say, burglary. Well, they can't actually burgle while they're in prison.
You're absolutely right, but where is the? I totally get where you're coming from, Claire. But I suppose where is the incentive to behave yourself? If you say to two prisoners, one who's well behaved, one who's badly behaved, you're both going to do your whole sentence. You're both going to do 5 years or whatever it is, and one of them behaves really well and one of them behaves really badly. Well, you can increase the sentence, I suppose, of the one who behaves badly, but there's no incentive for the good person to, or not the good person, but the well-behaved prisoner to behave well. Does there not have to be some incentive in all of that, Claire?
Well, it's an incentive for actually the prison service. It's not an incentive as to how they are going to behave when they're let out.
Yeah.
I mean, this can be an incentive for the prison service. That's all it's about. You know, behave well, don't cause any trouble while you're in prison, you know, and we'll give you an easy let out. But it isn't actually making them into... they're model prisoners. It's made them into model prisoners. It hasn't made them into model citizens. When they get out, you know, you know, all those things that they were doing. I mean, a rapist, he you know, a wife beater. His wife isn't there to beat her. You know, a rapist, unless you're in prison, a man's prison, and you've raped a man, then you could misbehave. You know what I'm getting.
And there are lots of ways they can misbehave and do the wrong thing in so many different ways. You make some really good points, Claire, and thank you for them. That's Claire in the Wirral. I want to thank Bob in Cheltenham, who's been in touch with the text as well, and he says, chemical castration immediately makes me think of Alan Turing in 1952 being prosecuted for homosexual acts and accepting hormone treatment to avoid imprisonment. This policy is just headline-grabbing tosh, says Bob. It's a barbaric measure that is totally unnecessary and is only temporary and can be reversed and won't address the root cause of sexual offending in the long term, which is often linked to more to control and violence over sexual attraction itself. There are effective therapeutic measures and monitoring orders to address those convicted of child sex offending. Great show, as always, says Bob in Cheltenham. I wonder what you make of that. 0344 499 1000. We're going to talk more about the Chagos Islands. Vanessa Kalu is part of the Friends of the British Overseas Territory. She's going to talk to us in just a second. We'll also hear what the Defence Secretary John Healing has been telling the House of Commons. I want your reaction to this as well. 0344 499 1000. Stay with us.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Thanks to the Red Ranger who's been in touch and says, David Gawke of the Sentencing Committee, the same guy who wanted white people to serve longer sentences than people who were part of other ethnicities. I'm somewhat surprised you didn't take him apart, Peter. No, they're totally different things. The Sentencing Review is David Gawke, the former Justice Secretary. That is not the same as the Sentencing Council, which is many people who were talking about that two-tier justice system. Believe me, if he had been on that, I would have absolutely taken him apart on that. But David Gawke has nothing to do with that. He's not on the Sentencing Council. That as people like the head of the Crown Prosecution Service, Baroness Sue Carr, is the Lady Chief Justice. So you're a bit confused there to the texter, or the tweeter I should say, who has sent that in. So David Gauke is no part of that. In the last few minutes, the Defence Secretary, John Healey, he's been defending the Chagos deal. Well, it's not really a deal, it's a surrender in the House of Commons. This is what Defence Secretary John Healey has said.
There is no viable alternative option than this deal. The senior military figure that was part of the treaty signing this afternoon, General Jim Hockenhull, confirmed that publicly. The Honourable Gentleman knows this. He was a Defence Minister until the last election. He knows that was the advice that he and his previous government were given. Even the spokesperson for his leader admitted in February that a deal is needed. Reported in Playbook, said a spokesperson for Badenoch insisted she understands negotiations over the islands are needed due to the international legal position. That is the job that we have done. They conceded the principle that a deal was required to safeguard the long-term protection and control of this base. They conducted 11 rounds of negotiation before the last election. We did the deal today.
That's the Defence Secretary John Healey there. He was talking, of course, about his Conservative opposite number, James Cartledge, when he was making those accusatory statements to him. The point that Keir Starmer made earlier was that he believes that, well, certainly I think the facts would show that the previous Conservative government conceded the point that the Chagos Islands should be surrendered to Mauritius, and the Labour government's carrying that out. And that's part of the defence, essentially, of the Labour government. Well, they didn't have to do it. They could have gone back on it. They could have said, we're a new government. We're not doing this any longer. Vanessa Kalu is a Chagosian lead at the Friends of the British Overseas Territories. This deal today, handing over the Chagos Islands and leasing back a military base for £101 million a year, I think it's a bad deal, but clearly this has real-world, day-to-day effects on Chagosians. Vanessa's one of them. What are your thoughts today, Vanessa?
Thank you for the opportunity. And my thought today, I'm so obsessed. All of the Chagosian is really obsessed with what Keir Starmer is doing. And the situation is, at the moment, how a UK Prime Minister ignore the British people and then just give away our island, who are British, and then at top of this, use the taxpayer of the British people to give away to a foreign country. This is unacceptable. And where there are a lot of issues in UK, we have homelessness, we have British people getting poorer and poorer. How they can do something like this, and he said that the first job he's doing is secure the nationality defence, giving away our island, who are UK sovereignty, to Mauritius, how it can protect the British in the UK. We don't trust that, and he knows he's doing something wrong. He has his own agenda with his, his friend as well. And as
do you fear now, sorry to interrupt you, Vanessa, do you fear now for the Chagosians who are in Mauritius themselves, who live in Mauritius, because their rights have been taken away consistently, haven't they, over the past few years? In fact, it has been illegal, I think, for the last 4 years to even suggest that Mauritius doesn't have a claim to the Chagos Islands. Freedom of speech in Mauritius is a big, big issue for the Chagosians who are there.
Yes, all the Chagosians who are in Mauritius around the world, if we support UK sovereignty, Mauritius government put a criminal code, 10 years imprisonment and 5 million rupees on top of us, just to stop us to doing what our right is. The government, we trust the government, the Labour government, to not repeat what the wrongdoing of the past, forcibly remove our ancestors to their own country, who are British citizens, and send and remove them to Mauritius. They've been living in poverty in Mauritius and despair over there. So now they're putting a code penal on everyone supporting UK sovereignty because we are British, and then we need to flag Mauritius coming to the UK. We're looking for support. No support. We have a lot of single British people fed for themselves in the UK. There are issues of homelessness. Why not using that tax money to help British in the UK instead of giving away to a country supposedly for national security? The national security is we need to protect the people, the British people first, and then protect other people as well.
I can't disagree with a word of that. Let's just remind ourselves of what the Prime Minister has said today about the deal.
Okay.
So there's no alternative but to act in Britain's national interest. By agreeing to this deal now on our terms, we're securing strong protections, including from malign influence, that will allow the base to operate well into the next century, helping to keep us safe for generations to come. Now, other approaches to secure the base have been tried over the years, and they have failed. Boris Johnson failed in his efforts to endlessly delay. Liz Truss then started the negotiations. We inherited a negotiation in which the principle of giving up UK sovereignty had already been conceded by the previous Tory government. Our deal has concluded those negotiations in the national interest.
Keir Starmer there, the Prime Minister. Vanessa, what do you make of his words there?
Giving away a British country, island, and giving away UK taxpayer is not protecting the British nationality.
It's very simple.
He's making us in danger. The Chagos Islands base is protecting UK, protecting everyone around the world. And
although they're leasing that military base back, it is costing money, but at least it's there. I wonder what you think of the. You must be very disappointed in regard to the court action earlier today, which has not been successful.
We were hoping that at least to stop that signature. Unfortunately, the judge rules in favor of the Prime Minister, and I believe that is really wrong. What Keir Starmer is doing is really wrong. Okay. It's not in the interest of British people. Okay. It's not interest because British people should be first. Chagos Islands is British overseas territory. If he can do that with Chagos Island, he can do that with all our heritage.
Vanessa, thank you for your thoughts. That's Vanessa Kalu, who is the Chagosian lead at the Friends of the British Overseas Territories. Thank you to her. What do you think about this? 0344 499 1000. Andy and Thatcham's been in touch and says, so Starmer says the Chagos deal is vital for our own national security. How? Why isn't he telling us why? Also, why is Cleverly or other Tories telling us why he could think this? I'm outraged he's given away our own sovereign lands. An absolute traitor. I think this will play into Reform's hands. Becca says, maybe a stupid question, but where's the king while the government are handing over our land? That's Becca in Norfolk. Not a stupid question at all, Becca, and thank you for asking it. I mean, the king essentially does what the government advises him to do. The king has ceremonial power, but no real political power. Stuart says, Labour lie again. There was an alternative to the Chagos deal. Yes, there was. Do nothing and keep the islands. Thank you to Brendan in London. He says, good afternoon, Peter. Regarding the person who messaged in asking why everything is broken when the UK is one of the richest countries, it's a very simple answer. Money can't buy you common sense. Great show, says Brendan in London. Sue in Walsall says, I once visited a prison with my job. They had a 2 to 3 story building which had individual rooms with locked front doors. These were for prisoners who behaved and did as they were told. They had their own gardens, their own keys, whereas the deterrent there for keeping out of prison, no one should have the luxuries they all had, such as their own TVs, game stations, etc. They're supposed to be being punished, not rewarded. You can understand why the same people go back time and time again. Maybe if they didn't have their home luxuries, they may think twice about reoffending. Says Sue in Walsall. It's a really big issue, Sue, and it's really interesting actually. There are many prisoners who actually, I mean, it's not that they like prison necessarily, but they have a routine and they have security and they have, you know, rules and a routine and a process in prison that they just don't have in so many common part, and in their lives, that is a very, very common thing. And some of them don't hate prison nearly as much because they get for 3 meals a day, for example, in a way that they perhaps wouldn't otherwise. They have a roof over their head in a way that they wouldn't otherwise. It's a really complex thing. I had a work visa, this person says, when I worked abroad when I was younger, and when my visa expired, I came home. Why do the people coming here on a work visa come with the expectation of staying permanently? We would have no problem here if everyone returned to their home country once their work visa ran out. I was exactly the same. I had a visa, I think it was called a J1, and I was in America for a year. I went back for another 6 months. I was told, no more than 2 years. That's it. Off you go. You can't come back to America, I think even as a tourist, for a full 2 years. That's what I did. I played by the rules. I love America as well. I'm going there later this year, actually. Derek says our daughter went to Sweden to study for a year when she was 18. We stayed here. 3 years later, she went to Australia on her own to get her master's degree. We stayed here. Leslie says Starmer staying Farage and the Tories are siding with Russia. He should remember he supported Corbyn to be our Prime Minister. Corbyn, of course, refused to condemn Russia for Salisbury. Very, very good point, and a lot of that is, of course, forgotten. We'll talk about the sport next here on Talk. We'll get your views as well on all of this. Keep your calls coming in, 0344 499 1000.
So we're still important. We're still important.
The scale.
Yeah, I mean, we're still importing a city the size of Bristol.
Yeah.
Every year through migration alone, far exceeds, probably doubles the number of new houses that we're building. And as you say, about 100k higher than it was when it was considered to be exceptionally high during Brexit. It was about 350k, and that's one of the things that triggered the Brexit vote. So actually, 430k to me, having been in this business for a very, very long time, is still far, far, far too high.
This is kind of like somebody who was 25 stone.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Let's take a look at the
Sport Summary on Talk.
Ian Danter is with us. He's a Talk Sport commentator. Ian, thanks for joining us this evening. Tottenham ending their long trophy drought last night, beating Manchester United in the Europa League final. What does victory mean for the future of the manager, Ange Postecoglou?
Well, judging by his press conference last night, he's quite sanguine about whether he stays or he goes. There seems to be a lot of conjecture at the moment as to whether he's done enough by winning this first trophy since 2008 for Tottenham to keep his job, because the league form has been so poor. They finished, in the lower reaches of the Premier League table, which is not where you would expect Tottenham Hotspur to finish. But given that win has now put Tottenham into the Champions League for next season, then it remains to be seen what sort of funds Postecoglou would be given as a manager to spend by Daniel Levy, the Spurs owner, how ambitious he would be. There could be a bone of contention that rises out of that, Peter, and I don't know. But Ange certainly, he said he wins trophies in the second season of a club he manages, and he's been true to his word.
The situation not so positive for Manchester United, though. Why does not qualifying for any what does not qualifying for any European competition actually mean for them? It's not good, is it?
No, it's not. It's a reset. It's and the ownership appear to have said that, you know, everything must go. Every Manchester United player is up for sale. There's no European football next season, and given profit and sustainability rules, they're going to have to box clever in the transfer market, and that might mean, Peter, that some of their academy stars who've come through the system, like Kobbie Mainoo, their central midfielder, and others like him, might have to be sold in order to generate funds that would normally come from being a Champions League side or being in European football, if you see what I mean. So there's a shortfall that's got to be made up somehow for Manchester United. And in amongst all that, they've got to find a way to adapt to Ruben Amorim's methods as a manager, because the change in system that he's brought in has not worked with the players he inherited. So it could be a real summer of upheaval at Old Trafford.
Let's turn to the cricket. It's the start of the England Test summer. They're battering Zimbabwe in Nottingham. What's the story of the day?
Well, 3 centurions for England, Zach Crawley, Ben Duckett and Ollie Pope, all hitting hundreds at the top 3 of the order. They're well into the 400s for just 2 wickets down at Trent Bridge. And I think it's the 4th time that an England top 3 have all scored a century. And I don't think any other country in Test cricket can match that record. And Zimbabwe are very much one of the minnows of international Test cricket. And they did get a bowler down through an injury today, but they've toiled out in the field. And, you know, with all the lovely weather we've been having, the pitch would be, I imagine, perfect for batting. And goodness me, how England have exploited that.
Thank you so much for all of that. The Ian Danter there is a TalkSport commentator, just bringing us up to date with all the sport today. And I just love this headline in the Sun today, actually. Take a Bilbao with Spurs 1, Manchester United 0. I have a feeling they may have written that before the match even started. I want to talk now to TJ in Derbyshire about the sentencing reforms. TJ, obviously you've got to be really careful, and we don't want to identify someone who is the victim of a sexual crime. But you have a really interesting story, and I wonder if you could tell me what it is.
Yeah, so we are a family who are a victim of a really serious crime. My daughter was raped.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
Yeah, it's just horrific. She was one of 3. He was a rapist. Now he was sentenced to 32 years 3 years ago. But I just feel that these sentencing things are just being put into place just to empty the prisons. I don't think the victims and the victims' families are being considered at all. I think once the sentencing's happened, a lot of people just think it just goes away. It really doesn't. I mean, only Thursday. What day is it today?
Thursday, yeah.
Tuesday, we had a letter from this saying that, you know, behind the scenes, that they've altered the dates for being eligible for him going into an open prison. He's only been in for 3 years, and they've already brought that forward, that he will be eligible to go into an open prison a lot sooner than he would have been. That's horrendous.
TJ, I just wonder if you could tell me a rapist to receive a sentence of 32 years, that is a very long sentence. Correct. I think that it's good that happened, but that is clearly a lot has happened there. Clearly that has been a really, really, like, rape is always serious, of course it is, but that is clearly a very, very bad person. And even worse than I'm choosing my words carefully here, TJ, but what I'm saying is it's a long sentence for a terrible crime, and indeed a series of crimes. TJ, I just wonder, what does it actually mean to you as a family that person, against a lot of the odds actually, because there are so few sexual crimes that are actually result in conviction, that person was convicted and is in prison? Because that entire process presumably took a long time a lot of evidence, a lot of going over statements. That whole process for you must have been incredibly traumatic, as well as dealing with your daughter who was dealing with the rape that had happened.
Well, it is. It was horrific, and it continues to be horrific. You know, we're now dealing with, coming back to the sentencing, it wasn't just rape. There were 3 ladies involved, but there was 13 charges in all, because, you know, you've got like the coercive control, and obviously that now covers sexual control, financial control, behavioural control. There was domestic violence. It was just a catalogue of horror.
I mean, that is a person who should be behind bars for 32 years. And I don't want them in an open prison. I want them somewhere where they are totally secure and not anywhere near any woman.
No, and that's the thing. And, you know, and when he was sentenced, you know, we were so relieved as a family, as were the other families, that he got the sentence he got. But what they don't tell you is that, you know, he goes away, he's got the sentence, but because he's a sexual offender, he's gone into a sexual offenders prison, which is not like going into Broadmoor. They're not locked up 23 hours a day. It's classed as a rehabilitation, more of a rehabilitation hospital.
Do you feel he's actually being in any way punished?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. With him being classed as a sex offender, they don't punish them. They try to rehabilitate them. It's all very softly. He's just not allowed out the grounds. He's not locked in his cell for 23 hours a day. And now we've just found out that he's going to be eligible for an open prison a lot earlier than he would have been.
And have they given you any reasoning for that? Is there any suggestion that, you know, he's been well behaved or he's earned that in any way?
The letter we had from the Home Office stated it was changes to the sentencing thing. So it's nothing to do with his behaviour. It's all to do with the logistics of the way they're treating prisoners and what they're doing with them.
I mean, there's so many people who will be absolutely horrified by what they're hearing. How long did the court's process take from actually reporting this to him being convicted?
Right. Okay. So September, just over. I'd say about 18 months.
Yeah. So that's about half the time, that 18 months, half the time that he's actually spent behind bars, and even, you know, now at 3 years, he's in a situation where you know, they're talking about moving him to an open prison. TJ, I want to explore this a little bit further with you. If you just hang on the line, if that's okay. We've got to go to the news right now because it's 6 o'clock and we've got to go to the news. But I want to talk to TJ a little bit more after the break, because I think there's more in this, and I want to get your reaction to it as well. 0344 499 1000.
across the UK. On DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Just gone 6 o'clock, this is Talk Drive. I'm Peter Cardwell. We're talking mainly about today about the Justice Review by David Gauke, the former Justice Secretary, and what that means in practicality. And just before the news there, I was talking to TJ, who is on the line still. And TJ, thanks for your patience. Apologies we had to interrupt the conversation. We just have to go to the news at 6 o'clock. At 6 o'clock. TJ has been telling us about her daughter who was raped. The man who raped her is in prison now. And just for people who are just tuning in at this exact point, TJ, the process took 18 months, which is a long process. Sometimes it takes longer. You got a conviction, which is excellent because that happens very rarely. You're now in a situation where he's served 3 years in prison, and you got a letter from, I think, the Ministry of Justice telling you that actually he could be eligible to go to an open prison or somewhere that's a lot easier to live in than the kind of prisons we think of when we think of places like Wormwood Scrubs or Belmarsh or wherever.
Yeah.
So just tell me your emotions today when you hear what David Gauke was saying, when you're talking and hearing about all of the sentence review, because you're a victim here, your daughter's a victim, and these ideas have real world consequences, TJ.
It's just so frustrating, and it just makes you really angry. And, you know, like I say, people think that the sentencing happens, he goes away, and everything's okay. It's really not. You know, we're dealing with trauma, which she's got so much PTSD. Her son, which is the son of the guy that raped her, so he's got trauma. It's an ongoing thing. We've only just come out of family court. That his court case was finished. We've had to go to family court for different reasons, which I don't want to go into in public.
I understand.
But it's an ongoing thing. It's not just a case of, you know, it'll be 2 years in July when he was sentenced, actually given the sentence. But it's been non-stop court since then. And then you find out, you know, the judge who sentenced him said, because it was such a horrific thing, and he considered him such a dangerous man, he wants him to serve a minimum of 16 years, which was actually 2/3 of the sentence, as opposed to what was at the time 50% of.
Yes.
And now we get a letter saying that he's going to be eligible for open prison a lot earlier than he would have done had it not happened. And it's just it just fills you with anger and frustration, and I just feel that the families, especially the victims of these people, are completely forgotten. It's all about emptying prisons and, you know, just moving people around like dominoes, and it's just not fair.
TJ, you've talked about your grandson, you've talked about your daughter. What about you? How are you doing?
Spinning plates, Peter, if I'm honest. It's, you know, as a mother, you just try everything you can to just make sure everybody else is okay. You know, the trial was a 4-week trial. Sitting and listening to everything that had happened, it was horrific then, and it'll never be anything other. But you know, you have to move forward. But when I say I'm spinning plates, I'm trying to deal with the trauma that I've gone through as a mother, listening to what's happened to my daughter and my grandson, as well as the other victims. But as a mum, you just put yourself on the back burner and try and look after everybody else, and it's hard. It's really hard, which is why it makes you so angry when the justice, well, to call it justice, you know, they decide to alter the goalposts all the time, and I do think the victims and the families, they don't care about them. It's all about emptying those prison cells.
TJ, I think this is the first time we've spoken, if I remember correctly. I just want to say that if you were my mum, I'd be really proud to be your son, because you're looking after your daughter and your grandson brilliantly, and I want you to when you come off the phone, I just want you to take a minute just to say, this has been a really tough time and I am doing an excellent job, because that's what you're doing, TJ.
Thank you. I mean, I am a strong woman and I raised a strong daughter, and, you know, we will get through this, Peter, but it's the injustice you feel from the justice system itself. It just angers you. You know, we can't change what's happened. We have to deal with what's happened.
Yeah.
But the justice system makes it harder.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story. I really appreciate that, TJ, and I wish you well and your whole family, including your daughter and grandson. TJ's story, says Bob in Cheltenham, is incredibly powerful and deeply troubling. The trauma and punishment for a victim of sexual violence or domestic abuse doesn't end when a perpetrator is sent to prison, says Bob. Sex offenders and domestic abusers being released from prison early to free up space in overcrowded jails is a continuation of the abuse of victims, but this time by our government and the criminal justice system. Powerful words there from Bob. Let's just remind ourselves of what Shabnam Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, said about this particular issue. It isn't apparently for rapists. This is in regard to paedophilia. Chemical castration, this is something that's been talked about in regard to this review by David Gauke, one of Shabnam Mahmood's predecessors as Justice Secretary. This is what she said, the Justice Secretary, to the House of Commons earlier today.
I also asked the review to consider how we manage sex offenders. The review has recommended we continue a pilot of so-called medication to manage problematic sexual arousal. I will go further, with a national rollout beginning in 2 regions covering 20 prisons, and I am exploring whether mandating the approach is possible. Of course, it is vital that this approach is taken alongside psychological interventions that target other causes of offending, like asserting power and control.
Shabnam Mahmood there, the Justice Secretary. She also addressed early release and the so-called good behaviour for inmates, a little bit of what we were talking about with TJ there. This is what the Justice Secretary, Shabnam Mahmood, said.
Under this model, an offender will not necessarily leave prison at an automatic point. Instead, their release date will be determined by their behaviour. If they follow prison rules, they will earn earlier release. If they do not, they will be locked up for longer. This echoes the model I witnessed in Texas earlier this year, which cut crime and brought their prison population under control.
Shabnam Mahmood there, the Justice Secretary. Let's get the thoughts of Danny Shaw, police and crime commentator, and Sir Bob Neal, KC, who's the former chairman of the Justice Select Committee in Parliament. Danny first, I think. Danny, I'm sure you will have heard at least some of what TJ was saying there. This has a huge effect on victims and members of the public who are concerned about this. What is your view as someone who's followed these issues for many years? How radical is this? How realistic is this?
Well, David Gauke's plan is very bold. It's pretty radical, and it could lead to fundamental change. It's brought about by necessity because, as we know, the prison system is running out of spaces. But I also think he's taken the opportunity to lay out a vision which he thinks needs to be done, which relies less on imprisonment and much more on community-based sentences. I think the government has accepted most of the proposals, and I am pretty sure that they will get the prison numbers down to a point that they can manage. But I am really concerned about the impact on confidence in the system, and listening to TJ there, huge sympathy for that. You know, one of the problems at the moment we have is that even if you get to court and you get a conviction, the sentence that's handed down is nothing like the sentence that's served. You know, it used to be 50%, now it's 40%. In future, it could be 33% with good behaviour, whatever that means, and compliance with the prison regime. So, you know, victims will know, and victims need to be told at the outset that there is a possibility that the offender will get, you know, a small amount of time in custody and actually a larger amount of time in the community when they'll be tagged. You know, my concern is that the advantage of prison, which is protecting the public, keeping dangerous people, keeping, you know, recidivists, keeping prolific burglars, sex offenders away from the public, that advantage, public protection, is sort of underplayed in this whole review and in the importance of our sentencing system. Prison does work in that respect.
It takes people off the streets, and they can't. People, you're absolutely right, Danny, and people can't commit crimes when they are in prison, or most crimes anyway. They're not out in society committing crimes. And Danny, you and I could talk continuously between now and 7 o'clock at the end of this programme and not scratch the surface of many of the problems in prisons. I just wonder specifically, I mean, the cause of, there are many causes of all of this, and as I say, it's a complex problem, but the Conservatives just didn't build enough prisons, did they? And Labour didn't build enough prisons previously. This is, if they just built more prison places, this is really a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it is just about prison capacity, isn't it? And that is a real feeling, a huge feeling, actually, over the last, of successive governments, including the Liberal Democrats and Coalition, over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think Labour's record on prison building was actually not bad. The Conservatives, as you say, added just 500 places to the prison estate, and that didn't keep up with all the various sentencing changes and laws that they were introducing that meant that more people were going to prison. And then the big explosion in police officer numbers that's led to more arrests and charges. But the problem, Peter, is that, of course, you could just invest even more in a prison building programme, but it is hugely expensive. A prison place costs about £54,000 per prisoner per year. Yeah. A community sentence costs in the region of £3,000 per offender per year. Now, for some offenders, for example, fraudsters, who don't pose a physical threat to members of the public, I think there's a strong argument to say, tag them, place them under house arrest, put restrictions on where they can travel and where they can drive, place other restrictions, perhaps seize some of their assets, whatever, but they don't necessarily have to be held in prison. I think for violent and sexual offenders, they absolutely do. And I think this is where the review is a little bit imbalanced, in my view, is that it just accepts that almost everyone is going to serve less time in jail.
Danny, thank you. That's Danny Shaw, police and crime commentator. Sir Bob Neal Casey is the former chairman of the Justice Select Committee in Parliament. Bob, will this work, do you think? Is this a solution to at least some of the problems that are in the justice system?
I think it does have the potential to be that, Peter. Yes, I think it does, and I think broadly I would support it. And, you know, listening, as you and Danny were, to TJ's conversation with you earlier, I think it's very important to say that we shouldn't allow it to be an either-or in the justice system between looking after the victims of crime on the one hand and preventing reoffending and rehabilitating those offenders who can be rehabilitated on the other. I think we ought to be trying to do both properly, and unfortunately at the moment I think often we fail on both counts. Why I think it's the right broad approach, we will have to look at the detail of course, is that whilst he's absolutely right that the violent offender needs to be locked up, I would think be perfectly happy for some time. What we're talking about here, particularly as earned release, is the majority of offenders who don't fall into that category. And even most of the serious offenders will at some point be released. Now, if you look at all the evidence, we imprison a higher percentage of offenders than virtually any other country in Western Europe. At the same time, we have virtually the highest rate of reoffending in Western Europe. So there are actually more victims because of that. So something's going wrong here. And those other countries have found that by reducing their prison population, getting the non-violent offenders out of the system, getting out the people who've got issues with drug addiction, mental health issues, lack of literacy, all manner of underlying problems. If you can, where you safely can, deal with those and punish them, but also rehabilitate them in a less expensive setting than the traditional prison, that gets better results. I think that's worth trying, not least from the victim's point of view.
Bob, what's your view on this chemical castration idea, this idea that paedophiles be chemically castrated? Do you think it'll actually I know it happens to some degree and it's a voluntary programme, but you can't mandate that, can you? Surely you'll have human rights lawyers coming out of our ears in terms of people saying that these people can't be chemically castrated. What's your, when you saw that, I mean, that's been the headline certainly in a number of different media outlets, including the Sun newspaper today. But I mean, how realistic is that really, Bob?
That does give me a bit of concern, Peter. And that's where, interestingly, Shabana Mahmood, the Justice Secretary, appears to be going further than David Gauke was suggesting. David said, let's continue with the pilots and on a voluntary basis. And I was listening on another outlet to a clinician who's very expert in this field, saying that he feels that part of the reason that this programme can work is because it's voluntary. And it creates, I think, legally quite a problem for doctors who work on the basis that they treat patients, and they treat patients on a voluntary basis.
Yeah, I think it's the kind of of thing that will just fall apart as a sort of souffle policy, really. Bob, thank you very much for speaking to us this evening. That's Sir Bob Neal, KC, who's a former chairman of the Justice Select Committee. Lots of people getting in touch, including one person who says this sentencing review seems to be more about the poor prisoners and nothing about the victims. If Lucy Connolly's case is anything to go by, no prisoners will be eligible for early release. Hi Peter, says another person, is it just me being sick of seeing Starmer pontificating, draped in the Union flag, handing over our sovereignty to the EU, now the Chagos Islands? What else is he capable of damaging in this country? Maureen in East Sussex says, Starmer says he inherited the Chagosian negotiations and had no choice but to do the deal. He also inherited the results of the referendum, but gives himself the right to ignore it. I have nothing but contempt for this man and for the Labour government, says Maureen. Trevor in Harrow says, Reform have said they will reclaim and ignore this deal with Mauritius over the Chagos Islands if they get into power. I hope they do, but legally, do you know if they can do this? I think it would be very difficult legally to do that. International law, you know, a treaty essentially with Mauritius. We'll see. Or maybe we won't. Maybe Reform UK will never be in power. I don't know. We'll see what happens. Certainly the polls at the moment have them riding high. David in Norfolk says, in my opinion, if you do the crime, you should do the time. 10-year sentence should mean 10 years served on life-sustaining rations and no extras like TVs and PlayStations, etc. That's a real deterrent, not reduce sentences for so-called good behaviour. Better still, bring back the death penalty for the worst offenders, i.e. murderers, rapists and paedophiles, says David in Norfolk. Peter, I think Keir Starmer, another person says, is intent on showing the rest of the world how weak and effective the UK is. This will only encourage more immigration. I cannot think of any benefit his and his government's actions have made so far. Brian in Spain says there is no rational or logical reason for the Chagos deal. It's one of, if not the most important strategic military bases in NATO. Well, we still have access, Brian, to the military base. We're just paying 101 million quid a year for the privilege. Brian continues, Starmer must have a hidden agenda behind his treasonous actions. Lots of people using treason and traitor and so on in regard to Keir Starmer in the last few days. Interesting. Haven't really heard that language before in regard to Starmer. Julie says, good afternoon, Peter. Regarding the Chagos Islands, now Starmer has signed off the deal. The Isle of Wight had better be careful, as they will be next. I think the Isle of Wight is very safe. And thank you to Lynn in Portsmouth, who made me smile today when she said, all the bad news today, you've made me smile, Peter, twirling your pen and trying to look interested in the sports. Lynn, are you suggesting that I am not interested in the sports update, that there's some sort of lack of engagement with the sport for some reason, just because I know absolutely nothing about it? Outrageous. Right then, we're going to talk more about Starmer being blamed for emboldening anti-Semitic attackers and what happened in Washington. Nicole Lampert is standing by. We're going to talk to her in just a second. Stay with us here on Talk.
The numbers are still rising at an enormous rate at a time when this country has catastrophically failed to build infrastructure to cope with it and is seeing its culture really being collapsed before our very eyes. And so, look, whether it's 400 or 500,000 net this year as opposed to the double that was last year, if you look in the early 1980s when this country actually did have one of the most successful immigration policies, I'd argue, in Europe, if not the world, net migration was around 40 to 70,000 per year.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Quite a lot of people getting in touch on Twitter about TJ. It's disgusting, says this person. TJ and her family are a classic example of how politicians are ignoring the safety of the British people. The first rule of any government is to protect those who put them in power. My thoughts go to TJ and her family for the way they are being treated. Thank you for that. Just a couple of other comments on Twitter as well. Clive says, it's frustrating we are talking about full prisons. Let's get these foreign prisoners out and send them back to their countries with no returns policy. Human rights lawyers are the problem. I'm fed up with this situation. On TJ as well, Mike says, I was really touched and teared up listening to you compassionately speaking to TJ. I'm sure her story was difficult for you to talk through, but you handled the situation well. You're highlighting a real problem that the government is clearly not managing appropriately. There's absolutely no excuse when we see how the government are mismanaging the country's finances. TJ is a very brave mother, and victims like her and her daughter deserve the utmost support and justice. The failures are directly the fault of the individual officials whose salaries are paid for by us. On Israel as well, quite a few people getting in touch about that, including Lady Lulu on Twitter, who says, unfortunately, Peter, I fear that the people spouting anti-Semitic, anti-Israeli propaganda don't critically check the facts because they've already made their minds up. It suits them to accept the unrealistic Hamas or UN news and pass it on. And this is an interesting one. Actually, I'll perhaps discuss this in a second with Nicole Lampert. Israel lets journalists into Gaza and they get kidnapped. What happens then, says Gary. Let's talk about that actually in a second with Nicole. But first of all, I want to just deal with the substantive issue, the absolutely horrendous murders in Washington, D.C. of two Israeli embassy officials and how it is being handled and why it has happened. Now, I don't think for a second that Keir Starmer is directly responsible in any way. I don't think that he is to blame. I don't think David Lammy is to blame. However, there is an atmosphere which has been created by a number of countries, including our own, including Canada and France, in regard to what Israel is doing at the moment. There's undoubtedly a very, very horrific humanitarian situation in Gaza, which we do need to talk about. But there's absolutely no excuse. There's no qualification. There is absolutely no reason why these two Israeli officials should have been targeted in any way. It is horrendous. It is awful. I woke up to the news today and was just absolutely shocked, and also kind of not shocked, but also just devastated by what happened. Nicole Lampert is with me, who's a journalist who follows these issues. Nicole, first of all, your reaction to what happened in Washington. It's just dreadful.
It's horrendous. As you say, it was horrendous to wake up to, but didn't feel surprising at all. I felt over the last few months this kind of ramping up, and particularly in the last week, actually, particularly in this country, with the rhetoric, with the Gary Lineker thing, even with Eurovision, it's felt like this, that we're in this pot, that we're reaching boiling point, and that it felt like something bad was going to happen. So it was both horrific and not surprising. And one of the saddest and most sadly ironic things is, you were talking about the letter that Keir Starmer had done with Macron and Carney from Canada, and Hamas welcomed that letter.
Yeah.
And then one of the last things that Yaron Levchinsky, who was the man that was murdered, that he retweeted was something from the Israeli embassy saying, if Hamas are on your side, you're on the wrong side of history.
Well, it's very interesting you should say that. And earlier, the Israeli Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar, spoke at a press conference attacking our government around, and indeed governments around the world, for believing, as he put it, Hamas propaganda. This is what he said.
I have been worried for the past few months that something like this would happen. This is the direct result of toxic, anti-Semitic incitement against Israel and Jews around the world that has been going on since the October 7th massacre. Recently, we have witnessed an unprecedented wave of terror attacks and attempts against Israeli missions around the world, with an emphasis on Europe. There is a direct line connecting anti-Semitic and anti-Israeli incitement to this murder. This incitement is also done by leaders and officials of many countries and international organizations, especially from Europe. These libels about genocide, crimes against humanity, and murdering babies paved the way exactly for such murders. This is what happens when leaders in the world surrender to the Palestinian terrorist propaganda and serve it. The statements and attacks blame Israel instead of Hamas.
There is a real issue here, Nicole. How do we navigate this? How do we, as friends of Israel, as people who want Israel to survive and thrive, who worry about the people there, but who nonetheless see the humanitarian suffering in Gaza, the innocent civilians who are suffering? I'll shed absolutely zero tears for any Hamas terrorist who dies, but there is clearly an issue here. How do we best navigate this, Nicole? And I'm asking for advice, not just for our viewers and listeners, but for me personally as well.
Navigate in what way, would you say?
In the sense of supporting Israel as much as we can, supporting the cause of freedom and justice and democracy, but also showing our concern and putting pressure, of course, on Israel, but mainly on Hamas as well, in regard to the humanitarian situation in Gaza.
I think you've kind of hit the key there, which is on Hamas as well, and that's something that's not been happening. So personally, I'm against any sort of siege. It is, of course, something that has happened in wars throughout history. For as long as there's been humans, this has been done. It's not something that I feel at all comfortable with. I'm glad to say that humanitarian aid is now going back in, so hopefully that won't be an issue. Of course, the issue remains that it's a dreadful war zone and this is horrendous for the people of Gaza. Some of them have been rebelling against Hamas, not enough. But of course, it's very dangerous for them. Those that did lead the campaigns were murdered. I think I talked to you about it at that time because I interviewed a few of them.
Yes.
I think one thing we need to do is just keep remembering and keep bringing up Hamas. And that's something that really struck me when David Lammy spoke in the Commons the other day. And he was talking about Israel bombing hospitals, but didn't mention that in the hospital that was bombed last week, that's where you had the Hamas leader and several other Hamas leaders. So if you're not if you're not criticizing Hamas for using hospitals and schools and for using their own people as human shields, then you're doing the entire war a disservice, which is why Hamas feels entitled to continue this, knowing it has the tacit support of the West, which refuses to call it out. It does astound me, I have to say.
On the propaganda victory, sorry to interrupt you, Nicole, but on the propaganda victory that's part of that as well, because Hamas doesn't care about its own people. Hamas wants the total of deaths to be as high as possible, because that means people blame Israel, when actually they're putting those people at risk in terms of having their headquarters, as they have right throughout this war and previously, in places like hospitals and schools.
Yeah. So you've got this ironic situation of people in Gaza calling out Hamas, and you've got supposed pro-Palestinians in this country refusing to do the same. So while
and all the while it massively underreported by so much of the media. I mean, I've been retweeting as much as I can. I've been talking about it on these programs. The fact is, there are an increasing number of people in Gaza who've had it. Who've had it with Hamas, who want Hamas to go. How often do we see that on our big bulletins and news stations? That's something that needs to be examined so much more.
Yeah, we also have Palestinians who are writing in English who are anti-Hamas Palestinians saying, if you're on our side, please show it. Stop being so pro-Hamas. But what we are seeing is that this great movement, these people that are marching in our streets, it's not actually about the Palestinians. They don't care about them, because if they did, they would be calling out Hamas. They care about, this is an anti-Western movement. And, an Israel fight is a fight that is a fight for Western values, for the West. It's against Islamic extremism. But what we have on our streets and all of that is we have this weird marriage of Islamism and the far left, who want a revolution. They don't, for them, the Palestinians, just as for Hamas, they're just a willing sacrificial lamb, or an unwilling sacrificial lamb. What they really want is what they say they want, which is intifada everywhere. They want violence and anger in the street.
When you repeat those words, and when you say the words like globalise the intifada, people listen, and that's part of the reason why what happened in Washington happened. Nicole, just before you go, I just wonder if I could ask you about our tweeter who did say about, why don't, was bringing up the issue about why journalists aren't let into Gaza by Israel and Egypt as well. Got to remember Egypt's part of this as well, which so many people forget. I just wonder whether you're in favour of independent journalists being allowed into Gaza. I know I am. Obviously, there's a huge risk of kidnap and all the rest of it, but there are many very experienced journalists who go into very, very difficult war zones all the time.
I am in favour of journalists going in, because I think at the moment all we are seeing is propaganda coming from Hamas. So in terms of, for Israel's sake, I think they probably should be allowed in. But at the same time, while journalists do go into war zones regularly, there hasn't really been a war zone like this where everything is a war zone, where, as we discussed, a hospital becomes a battlefront.
Yeah.
So that makes it more dangerous. There have been journalists that have gone into Gaza embedded with the IDF. And I don't know how safe journalists are going to be just running around Gaza, because of course there is the other idea that Hamas are still in control of large parts of Gaza. So if they're not embedded with the IDF, are they therefore at the behest of Hamas, and how does that help anybody?
Very good points, well made, as always. Nicole Lambert, journalist there, thank you for her contribution. Appreciate that. Lots of people getting in touch on all sorts of matters. 0344 499 1000. We'll take some of your calls in just a second. And if you want to join that conversation, I'll give that number one more time, 0344 499 1000.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on YouTube, on the app, on your mobile, the home of common sense. This is...
Well, thank you so much to everybody for being in touch. A couple of voice notes now on Chagos. Steve has been in touch.
Have you heard him, that Keir Starmer? He thinks we're all stupid. Couldn't he have just said, no, we're not doing this anymore, instead of trying to blame the Tories from the last government?
Yeah, I mean, like, that's a fair point. And they didn't have to do what they inherited from the Conservatives, no doubt about that. Mark's also been in touch on this issue.
So I'm sorry, but I keep hearing Keir Starmer saying that they had to do the deal. They didn't have to do the deal, because if the Americans said no, the deal wouldn't have happened.
Thank you for that, Mark. Sean is in Widnes and has given me a ring on 0344 499 1000. Sean, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Hi, Peter.
Hi
what it is hiya. What it is why didn't we spend the money on the Chagos Islands we put like the illegal immigrants? Why don't we put them over there? Build a...
It's a long way to go, but certainly they said no to the Rwanda plan, and there are very few people who actually live in the Chagos Islands. Maybe the facilities wouldn't be there, but I know what you mean. I mean, it was a resource. It was part of our overseas territories, and maybe we should have used it better.
Well, whatever we got to process them, we'd have to build something. We're saving money on not giving. So we're giving them 100 million a year.
That's right.
So we're saving that. We keep our island. And then we put them over there, and there's a military base on there, so there's an army, so they can look after them a little bit better, send a few more soldiers over there, and it saves another expense.
Yeah, well, we're
struggling.
And I don't know, Sean. I'm still in the dark as to why we've given them away in the first place. Do you know?
I just think Starmer's building his own future, like Tony Blair did when he was in. It's traitorous, like people have said. I believe what he's doing. He shouldn't be doing what he's doing.
Okay, Sean, thanks for your thoughts there. Lee in Birmingham's texted in to say, I'm very concerned about the future of the Falklands. Gibraltar, Northern Ireland has already been betrayed. It comes under the ECHR with the Belfast Agreement. Let me just read out a couple of other messages as well, including from David on chemical castration. He says it's a law and order dead cat. Reducing sentences of serious criminals is the real story. It is a criminals charter and makes the UK an unsafe country. That's David in the Cotswolds there. James says, hello, Peter. The woman who was on the phone to do with her daughter being raped, I feel the rapist should be kept in prison for the full 32 years. James, totally agree with you. Cardi P says, Neil, mixed messages today from James Cleverly. He said the Tories walked away from the Chagos deal, yet Starmer said otherwise. What's the truth? Well, I think Starmer's right in that they accepted the legal principle that the Chagos Islands be given away. They didn't do much about it necessarily, but of course it is Labour that has surrendered them. But they're also saying, well, we had to do it because we inherited it. So, I mean, the Tories didn't actually give them away, but Labour has, but didn't have to, would be my clear view on it. Nickley Pickley, yes, I love these different names on Twitter. Nickley Pickley says, how are people who've committed serious sexual offences not considered dangerous? And the punishment is not in the original sentence, it's in serving that sentence. If you reduce the time, you reduce the punishment. Mike says, will chemical castration also be given to female teachers abusing young boys? James says, David Gauke was no Conservative. He's a wet Liberal lefty. He has done all he could to undermine and damage this country. I think James might be talking about David Gauke's views on Brexit. Certainly he was chucked out of the Conservative Party under Boris Johnson. Another person says it's heartbreaking and frightening in equal measure. Starmer now condemns Israel and is restricting the export of components to Israel. He said he stamped out anti-Semitism in his party. It now has a green light. Israel is our ally and has special status in NATO. Elle has been in touch and said, I cried for 2 hours this morning after hearing about this horrific attack. Jonathan Sacerdote earlier on perfectly sums up the dangers for Jews globally and why silence is not an option. Elle, thank you for your thoughts there. And just on TJ, just one more from Kanzi, who says, I've been watching talk for many years, never have been brought to tears. Your conversation with TJ brought me to tears. What a brave woman, says Kanzi. Well, thank you very much indeed for that. On sentencing reform, Stephen's in Cambridgeshire. Stephen, what are your thoughts this evening?
Well, not only are we being forced, the British public, the general public, not the upper class, being forced to live among undocumented migrants, we're now going to be forced to live amongst criminals that know whatever they do, they're only going to get a minuscule sentence.
And I think it's a very fair point. And prison should be a deterrent. You shouldn't want to go to prison, but it should also be there if you commit a crime. And it's really interesting, actually, what Robert Jenrick has said, the Shadow Justice Secretary, when he says, by scrapping short prison sentences, Starmer is effectively decriminalising crimes like burglary, theft and assault. This is a gift to criminals who will be free to offend with impunity.
Yeah, he is. And as for those bracelets, you know, the ankle bracelets.
Yeah.
G4S were ridiculed, I forget how many years ago now, because of the incompetence of the monitoring of them.
Yeah. Well, the monitoring is a big thing, and it has to be done properly. And it's not okay simply to say, right, well, just put them on bracelets or these ankle bracelets or whatever. I mean, you're absolutely right, Stephen, in that if there is an alternative to prison, it has to be done properly. And I'm just not confident. I don't know what you think, but I'm just not confident that it will be done properly.
No, mate, it won't. And like he says, oh, there's no money and it costs this, and this, you know. But they seem to find unlimited amounts of money for stuff they want to do that keeps them in the limelight. But for stuff that would help the general public, there's never any money.
Yeah. Stephen, thanks for your thoughts. Appreciate them. Wise words, and I'm sure many people will agree with them. I agree with the vast majority of what Stephen's saying. We're going to talk in just a second to a professor at Cambridge University, because he's South African and knows about what is happening there at the moment. Because around this time yesterday, huge story in the Oval Office about the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was certainly talked to in a way that he wasn't quite used to, I think, by Donald Trump in regard to what's happening to white farmers in South Africa. We'll talk to Saul in just a second. Stay with us.
Point is, they have now demonstrated to the world in this negotiation, as in so many others, that under any kind of pressure they roll over. This is a really, really negative signal they're sending to the world, just as we're seeing with a U-turn on winter fuel allowance because their backbenchers got a little bit shirty. Keir Starmer and the Labour government do not have the resolve to act in the national best interest.
Across the UK, on DAB+, on your smart speaker, on your smart TV, and on your side. This is Talk.
Well, Professor Saul Dubois is with me now. He is Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at Cambridge University. Saul, thank you for joining me this evening. It's been an absolutely extraordinary 24 hours. Around this time yesterday in the Oval Office, President Trump was talking to the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa in regard to white farmers. This is just a flavour of what happened.
These are articles over the last few days. Death of people. Death, death, death.
Our government policy is completely against what he was saying, even in the parliament.
But you do allow them to take land.
No.
You do allow them to take land.
Nobody can take land.
And then when they take the land, they kill the white farmer. And when they kill the white farmer, nothing happens to them.
No, there is
nothing happens.
There is criminality in our country. People who do get killed, unfortunately, through criminal activity, are not only white people. Majority of them are black people. And we have now
the farmers are black. The farmers are not black. I don't say that's good or bad, but the farmers are not black. And the people that are being killed in large numbers, and you saw all those grave sites, and those are people that loved ones going, I guess on a Sunday morning, they told me, to pay respect to their loved ones that were killed. Their heads chopped off. They died violently. I will say this, that if the news wasn't fake, like NBC, which is fake news, totally, one of the worst, ABC, NBC, CBS, horrible. But if they weren't fake news like this jerk that we have here, if we had real reporters, they'd be covering it. But the fake news in this country doesn't talk about that.
Extraordinary exchange there between Donald Trump and the South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. Saul, it's an interesting one for lots of reasons, but it does highlight the fact that white farmers have been attacked in South Africa. We know, of course, in Zimbabwe previously there were attacks on white farmers. What is actually the case in terms of what is happening, and who is, I suppose, where does the truth lie in this conversation?
Well, the truth is fairly simple. There is no white genocide in South Africa. White farmers have been killed. Many people in South Africa have guns. South Africa is a deeply unequal country economically. The issues of land dispossession have not been addressed. And many white farmers, many farmers, feel very threatened and have reason to feel threatened. But there is no systematic political attempt to kill white farmers. President Ramaphosa was quite right to say that this is about criminality. Black farmers have been attacked. In fact, he didn't mention, he had good reason not to mention, Ramaphosa himself is a major breeder of game. He has his own farm, and his own farm was robbed. So he's quite right. This is not directed at white farmers, and certainly not directed at Afrikaner farmers, but that's not to say that people don't feel vulnerable.
Of course, and worrying, I would imagine, about the repeat of what happened in neighbouring Zimbabwe, but that is not happening.
Well, it's not happening in Zimbabwe, which was much more a war for liberation based on land and the restitution of land. There have been seizures of white land, and much of that land has been distributed amongst the ruling party. In South Africa, although a land restitution bill has recently been passed, it's controversial, it will be subject to the courts. There is a strong constitutional court, and systems like willing buyer, willing seller, and so forth. There's been no expropriation of land so far.
So what has changed? Well, sorry to interrupt you. What actually has changed with that legislation? Are we in a situation where land will change hands in some way non-voluntarily, or is it always voluntary?
Well, for 30 years, everybody has agreed that there has to be some form of land transfer. White farmers own the vast majority of the productive land. Everybody recognizes this. They've not yet been able to find a mechanism. In fact, you could turn this round and say 30 years after the transition to democracy in 1994, it's extraordinary that so little land has changed hands. But there has been no expropriation, and if there were to be forced expropriation or compulsory expropriation, rather like Trump himself is doing in Texas, that will be tested by the courts.
Do you think Donald Trump helped the issue yesterday in any way, or did he actually set back the issue in regard to the land debate in South Africa? We're talking about it now. We probably wouldn't have been without what happened in the Oval Office. Lots of other people are having the conversation. It's raising awareness, but as you correctly say, there are some false allegations, particularly the word genocide, a massively overused word, certainly in regard to South Africa, certainly in the Middle East as well. I wonder what you make of what Donald Trump did, and I wonder if you can perhaps drill down into why you think he did it.
Well, Donald Trump has been obsessed for a long time. In fact, in his first, in 2016, influenced by Tucker Carlson, he began to experiment in South Africa with white replacement and started this idea that Afrikaners and whites are being chased off the land. I think this is an American story rather than a South African story. And the irony of yesterday is that Ramaphosa, who probably picked up from the Zelensky disaster, and who himself is an extremely skilled negotiator, brought along to the Oval Office two South African golfers and the wealthiest South African, an Afrikaner, Johan Rupert, all of them Afrikaners in one form or another, all of them prepared to support the government. And I don't think they are such government supporters. What has happened in the last 24 hours has actually, we're seeing in South Africa, a kind of patriotic reaction against Trump, which is not so different from what we saw in Canada just a few weeks ago.
Okay, thank you very much. You really illustrated that issue for us there, Professor Sol Dubois, there, Smuts Professor of Commonwealth History at Cambridge University. Breaking news here on Talk, and that is that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said Sir Keir Starmer is on the wrong side of humanity after he called for an end to the war in Gaza. Netanyahu attacked the leaders of the UK, France and Canada for criticising Israel's approach to Gaza. That was a few days ago, an extraordinary joint statement between the three of them, and clearly relations between Israel and the UK and Canada and France at a really low ebb. We saw, of course, the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom, CP Hodavelli. She was called in to the Foreign Office, given a dressing down, and told that the trade talks that were happening between Israel and the United Kingdom had been suspended. Netanyahu specifically linking their criticism, the criticism of Starmer and Macron in France and Mark Carney in Canada, specifically linking the criticism to the killings in Washington, D.C. of the Israeli embassy workers Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram. That is an extraordinary thing. That is a major, a sinking ever lower of the diplomatic relationship between Israel and the United Kingdom. That is the breaking news, that the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said Sir Keir Starmer is on the wrong side of humanity after he called for an end to the war in Gaza. Netanyahu specifically linking the criticism of the UK, France and Canada to the murders we saw overnight in Washington, D.C. of Israeli embassy workers Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram. Very strong words from Benjamin Netanyahu there. It'll be fascinating to see how Keir Starmer responds to that. Susan's in Hertfordshire and has been in touch about this very, very big and growing, very sadly growing issue of anti-Semitism. Susan, you're very welcome to the programme. What would you like to say?
Oh, hi, Peter. I listen to you all the time.
Thank you, Susan.
It's the first time I've spoken to you. I woke up this morning and I was devastated. The news from Washington was just horrendous. And, you know, listening to other radio stations with all this nonsense about the babies, etc., etc. But Jonathan Sassadoti couldn't have put it better. I mean, the way that he spoke, it was so impassioned. I was actually very moved hearing him.
Me too.
You know, being Jewish myself, you know, and obviously living in this country all my life with my father, my grandparents, fighting for this country in wars. My daughter and her boyfriend were recently attacked in central London.
I'm so sorry to hear that. Why were they attacked?
because her boyfriend is visibly Jewish, he wears a kippah. And as soon as these people saw him, I mean, my daughter said to me, Mum, I've never seen such hatred. And if they had had a knife, they would have killed, my boyfriend. I won't say his name. They would have killed him.
Did the police get the perpetrators?
The police got them, yes, and they have been amazing. Actually, it's all being dealt with and it's all being handled amazingly.
Okay.
But it saddens me so much that, having grown up in this country as a very proud Jew, that my daughter, who is like fifth-generation Jew, is subjected to horrible anti-Semitism. She's told she's not welcome here. She's told that, her mother is an effing whatever.
Outrageous.
And it breaks my heart. I went to a Jewish primary school, and I used to walk home from school with the Star of David on my blazer, and I never, ever felt threatened being Jewish.
Yeah.
But today, my children, my daughter was subjected to such hideous anti-Semitism that I've never experienced in my life. And, I think this government has got a lot to answer for, this government and the Conservative government, that have allowed these marches to go on week with such hatred and such disgusting things that I've never seen in my life in this country.
Yeah.
And it seems to be, we seem to be, as Jews, the only minority that are subjected to this without other people saying, actually, not in our name. I mean, and I know,
Susan, do you know what? There's a longer conversation here, and I want to have it with you tomorrow. Is that okay? I've got to talk to Kevin O'Sullivan now. We're 2 minutes away from the news. Can we ring you back tomorrow and have a longer conversation?
Okay, yeah.
I really want to get your voice on the air properly, Susan, and I really appreciate what you're saying, but I do want to talk to Kevin now. We'll ring Susan back tomorrow, Susan in Hertfordshire there. Horrendous story, and we'll get more detail of that. Kevin, what's coming up in your programme?
Major exclusive in about 5 minutes. Lucy Connolly's husband, Raymond, is coming on to tell his story exclusively to me, to this station. We know what he's been through.
Yes.
He's still struggling to bring up his 12-year-old daughter alone. He is devastated and heartbroken after the appeal court's decision to keep his wife behind bars at the beginning of this week, a decision that I think shocked and appalled the nation. I mean, her continued incarceration for 31 months for hurty words on social media